What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. What you're about to hear is part 2 of American Guerrillas, an ongoing series covering the Kansas territorial period and the Kansas-Missouri border war. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, you will be a little bit lost as we get into the beginning of this one, so I strongly recommend doing that first. If you like hearing your stories out of order, or if you've already heard part 1, welcome. I've decided to split episode 2 into 2 parts, so this is more like a part 2A, if you will. I got towards the end of what was originally supposed to be part 2 and figured out that even if I rushed to cram in all the material I wanted to fit in, it would still have ended up being longer than part 1. I didn't really want that. I figured 2 3-hour episodes would be better than 1 6-hour episode, and there was kind of a natural stopping point near the middle anyway. So you get a whole episode largely dedicated to one of my least favorite figures in all of American history. So I hope you enjoy it. The other upshot of that is that part 2B, which I'm now calling part 3, is mostly done already. So I'm going to take a couple more weeks to flesh out the end of that one without rushing, and it'll be out pretty soon. Before we get started, I'll remind you that this is a one-man show. I do all the research and writing for this show myself. I assure you it is a lot of work, and I think it's a really great product. I mean, come on, you know you won't find anything else like it about this topic on the internet. If you agree and you'd like to show your appreciation and help me make more of these, stick around to the very end, after the outro music, to hear about how you can donate. And that'll do it for the preamble. So without further ado, American Guerrillas, Part 2. Let's go.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie. I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
There's a famous painting I want to tell you about. It's a mural, actually, on the north wall of the second-floor rotunda of the Kansas State Capitol building in Topeka. I grew up in Topeka, and when I was a kid in school, my classes would take field trips to the Capitol building every so often. This mural was always one of the most memorable parts of the experience. It's a striking and dramatic mural, and it's huge, 11 feet 4 inches tall by 31 feet wide. The setting is a Kansas prairie landscape. In the distance, dark storm clouds hang over the horizon. On the right side, a prairie fire ravages the landscape. And on the left, a tornado throws up a dust cloud from the plain. In the middle distance, a covered wagon train rolls across the prairie, with settlers either bound for Kansas or just passing through on their way to Oregon or California. The most dramatic action is in the foreground. The scene is split between 2 groups of figures. On the left, a Free State settler stands heroically with his rifle at the head of a group of his comrades. Just behind him, a minister or reverend stands with his right hand upheld and a Bible in his left hand, as if to say, God is on our side. And over the group, the Stars and Stripes flutters in the wind. On the right is their opposition. 2 border ruffians, one armed with a rifle and one with a revolver, face the Free State leader on the other side. But their faces are obscure. The foremost has his back turned to the viewer, and the second has his face in shadow. Behind the two figures, a group of black slaves cower as another white man stands over them aggressively. And over this group flies the stainless banner, the second national flag of the Confederacy. At the feet of these two groups, the grass is blackened as if by fire, and two soldiers, one Union and one Confederate, each on his respective side, lie dead on the ground facing each other, their mingled blood staining the black ground. The size of the mural makes these figures all roughly life-size, maybe slightly smaller than life-size. But at the center of the mural, at the focal point, stands a giant. He towers over the scene, twice as tall as the other figures. He's dressed as a frontiersman, with a long brown overcoat and tall boots, with a cutlass and revolver hanging from his belt. His long white beard streams in the wind, his mouth wide open in a yell and a wild look in his eyes. His bloody hands are outstretched in a cruciform pose. In his right hand he holds a Sharps rifle, the symbolic weapon of the Free State movement, and in his left hand an open Bible with the Greek letters Alpha and Omega visible on its pages. Many descriptors could be applied to the giant at the center of the mural, as the mural portrays him. Prophetic, apocalyptic, even messianic. The mural depicts him as the central figure in the war between the states. He presides over the other symbols of not just bleeding Kansas, but the larger Civil War itself, almost as if he's the one who brought it into being. And once you know who this figure is, if you thought he was the single man most responsible for bringing the war about, you wouldn't be too far off the mark. At least in one sense. If you haven't seen this mural before, I highly recommend looking it up online, and I'll leave a link in the show notes to it. If you're able to make it to Topeka, I even more highly recommend visiting the Capitol building to see the original for yourself. Since it's an almost 12-foot tall mural, you really have to see it at its original size to feel the full impact. The mural is called Tragic Prelude. It was painted by an artist named John Stewart Curry, and it's probably the most famous image ever to come out of the state of Kansas. The giant figure at the center is among the most famous people ever to be associated with Kansas, if not the most famous. It is, of course, none other than one John Brown. The first descriptor I would apply to John Brown is anomaly, outlier. He really is a guy who it seems almost impossible to categorize. Not that people haven't tried. He's been variously called hero, freedom fighter, revolutionary, religious fanatic, deranged, terrorist, mass murderer. Where to even start with Brown is a challenge to figure out, but it seems natural to start with his life and background prior to his involvement in the Kansas conflict. The first glimpse I'll give you of Brown's life is in the words of the man himself. George Luther Stearns was a wealthy Massachusetts businessman and a character in the story in his own right. We'll talk more about him in a future episode, but for the moment, the more important figure is actually his young son, Henry. Later in his life, Henry Stearns wrote the following, quote, "On Sunday, January 4th, 1857, John Brown came to our house to consult with my father and mother about the troubles in Kansas. I was at that time about 12 years old and listened attentively to the conversation and to all he said about them, and young as I was, I had some idea of the meaning of it. Especially was I touched by what he said about the suffering of the little children there. When he was about to take his leave, I went to my father and in a whisper asked him if I could give what pocket money I had to Captain Brown. I received permission to do so, and running to the place where I kept it, I took it to John Brown and said, "Will you please buy something with this for some poor little boy in Kansas?" He patted me on the head and replied, "I will, my son, and God bless you for your kind heart." Then I said, "Captain Brown, will you sometime write me a letter and tell me what sort of little boy you were?" He smiled and said he would when he could spare the time. End quote. John Brown did indeed write that letter in July of the same year, and I'm going to read it for you in its entirety. It's a little long, but I think it'll be worth it to give you Brown's unfiltered take on his own life up to the year 1857. In his book, Midnight Rising, John Brown and the Raid That Sparked the Civil War, Tony Horwitz introduces the letter this way, quote, "The letter was didactic in tone, doubtless intended to impress Henry's wealthy father as much as the boy himself. But it was nonetheless a telling account, delivered in the direct, emphatic, and grammatically irregular voice that distinguished so much of Brown's speech and writing." End quote. Brown does have a unique writing style that might not always come through very well when reading it out loud. So if you want to actually see what his style was like on paper, go look up some of Brown's letters online. Scans of his actual handwritten letters are pretty easy to find. Not of this particular letter, but you can find other ones. So let's read the letter. Quote, "Red Rock, Iowa, 15th July, 1857. Mr. Henry L. Stearns, my dear young friend, I have not forgotten my promise to write you, but my constant care and anxiety have obliged me to put it off a long time. I do not flatter myself that I can write anything that will very much interest you, but have concluded to send you a short story of a certain boy of my acquaintance, and for convenience and shortness of name, I will call him John. This story will be mainly a narration of follies and errors, which it is to be hoped you may avoid. But there is one thing connected with it, which will be calculated to encourage any young person to persevering effort, and that is the degree of success in accomplishing his objects, which to a great extent marked the course of this boy throughout my entire acquaintance with him, notwithstanding his moderate capacity and still more moderate acquirements. John was born May 9th, 1800, at Torrington, Litchfield County, Connecticut, of poor but respectable parents, a descendant on the side of his father of one of the company of the Mayflower who landed at Plymouth, 1620. His mother was descended from a man who came at an early period to New England from Amsterdam in Holland. Both his father's and his mother's fathers served in the War of the Revolution. His father's father died in a barn at New York while in the service in 1776. I cannot tell you of anything in the first 4 years of John's life worth mentioning, save that at an early age he was tempted by 3 large brass pins belonging to a girl who lived in the family, and stole them. In this he was detected by his mother, and after having a full day to think of the wrong, received from her a thorough whipping. When he was 5 years old, his father moved to Ohio, then a wilderness filled with wild beasts and Indians. During the long journey, which was performed in part or mostly with an ox team, he was called on by turns to assist a boy 5 years older, who had been adopted by his father and mother, and learned to think he could accomplish smart things in driving the cows and riding the horses. Sometimes he met with rattlesnakes, which were very large, and which some of the company generally managed to kill. After getting in Ohio in 1805, he was for some time rather afraid of the Indians and of their rifles, but this soon wore off, and he used to hang about them quite as much as was consistent with good manners, and learned a trifle of their talk. His father learned to dress deerskins, and at 6 years old John was installed a young buckskin. He was perhaps rather observing, as he ever after remembered the entire process of deerskin dressing, so that he could at any times dress his own leather, such as squirrel, raccoon, cat, wolf, or dog skins, and also learned to make whiplashes, which brought him some change at times, and was of considerable service in many ways. At 6 years old, John began to be quite a rambler in the wild new country, finding birds and squirrels and sometimes a wild turkey's nest. But about this period he was placed in the school of adversity, which, my young friend, was a most necessary part of his early training. You may laugh when you come to read about it, but these were sore trials to John, whose earthly treasures were very few and small. These were the beginning of a severe but much-needed course of discipline, which he afterwards was to pass through, and which it is to be hoped has learned him before this time that the Heavenly Father sees it best to take all the little things out of his hands which he has ever placed in them. When John was in his 6th year, a poor Indian boy gave him a yellow marble, the first he had ever seen. This he thought a great deal of, and kept it a good while, but at last he lost it beyond recovery. It took years to heal the wound, and I think he cried at times about it. About 5 months after this, he caught a young squirrel, tearing off his tail in doing it, and getting severely bitten at the same time himself. He, however, held on to the little bobtail squirrel, and finally got him perfectly tamed, so that he almost idolized his pet. This too he lost, by its wandering away or by getting killed, and for a year or two John was in mourning, and looked at all the squirrels he could see to try and discover bobtail if possible. I must not neglect to tell you of a very bad and foolish habit to which John was somewhat addicted. I mean telling lies, generally to screen himself from blame or from punishment. He could not well endure to be reproached, and I now think had he been oftener encouraged to be entirely frank, by making frankness a kind of atonement for some of his faults, he would not have been so often guilty in after life of this fault, nor have been obliged to struggle so long with so mean a habit. John was never quarrelsome, but was excessively fond of the hardest and roughest kinds of plays, and could never get enough of them. Indeed, when for a short time he was sometimes sent to school, the opportunity it afforded to wrestle and snowball and run and jump and knock off old seedy wool hats offered to him almost the only compensation for the confinement and restraints of school. I need not tell you that with such a feeling, and but little chance of going to school at all, he did not become much of a scholar. He would always choose to stay at home and work hard rather than be sent to school, and during the warm season might generally be seen barefooted and bareheaded, with buckskin breeches suspended, often with one leather strap over his shoulder, but sometimes with two. To be sent off through the wilderness alone to very considerable distances was particularly his delight, and in this he was often indulged, so that by the time he was 12 years old he was sent off more than 100 miles with companies of cattle, and he would have thought his character much injured had he been obliged to be helped in any such job. This was a boyish kind of feeling, but characteristic, however. At 8 years old, John was left a motherless boy, which loss was complete and permanent, for notwithstanding his father again married to a sensible, intelligent, and on many accounts a very estimable woman, yet he never adopted her in feeling, but continued to pine after his own mother for years. This operated very unfavorably upon him, as he was both naturally fond of females and, withal, extremely diffident, and deprived him of a suitable connecting link between the different sexes, the want of which might under some circumstances have proved his ruin. When the war broke out with England, his father soon commenced furnishing the troops with beef cattle, the collecting and driving of which afforded him some opportunity for the chase, on foot, of wild steers and other cattle through the woods. During this war he had some chance to form his own boyish judgment of men and measures, and to become somewhat familiarly acquainted with some who have figured before the country since that time. The effect of what he saw during the war was to so far disgust him with military affairs that he would neither train or drill, but paid fines and got along like a Quaker until his age finally has cleared him of military duty. During the war with England, a circumstance occurred that in the end made him a most determined abolitionist and led him to declare, or swear, eternal war with slavery. He was staying for a short time with a very gentlemanly landlord, since a United States Marshal who held a slave boy near his own age, very active, intelligent, and good-feeling, and to whom John was under considerable obligation for numerous little acts of kindness. The master made a great pet of John, brought him to table with his first company and friends, called their attention to every little smart thing he said or did, and to the fact of his being more than 100 miles from home with a company of cattle alone, while the Negro boy, who was fully, if not more than his equal, was badly clothed, poorly fed, and lodged in cold weather, and beaten before his eyes with iron shovels or any other thing that came first to hand. This brought John to reflect on the wretched, hopeless condition of fatherless and motherless slave children, for such children have neither fathers nor mothers to protect and provide for them. He sometimes would raise the question, is God their father? At the age of 10 years, an old friend induced him to read a little history and offered him the free use of a good library, by which he acquired some taste for reading, which formed the principal part of his early education, and diverted him in a great measure from bad company. He, by this means, grew to be very fond of the company and conversation of old and intelligent persons. He never attempted to dance in his life, nor did he ever learn to know one of a pack of cards from another. He learned nothing of grammar, nor did he get at school so much knowledge of common arithmetic as the 4 grand rules. This will give you some general idea of the first 15 years of his life, during which time he became very strong and large of his age and ambitious to perform the full labor of a man, at almost any kind of hard work. By reading the lives of great, wise, and good men, their sayings and writings, he grew to a dislike of vain and frivolous conversation and persons, and was often greatly obliged by the kind manner in which older and more intelligent persons treated him at their houses, and in conversation, which was a great relief on account of his extreme bashfulness. He very early in life became ambitious to excel in doing anything he undertook to perform. This kind of feeling I would recommend to all young persons, both male and female, as it will certainly tend to secure admission to the company of the more intelligent and better portion of every community. By all means endeavor to excel in some laudable pursuit. I had liked to have forgotten to tell you of one of John's misfortunes which set rather hard on him while a young boy. He had by some means, perhaps by gift of his father, become the owner of a little ewe lamb, which did finely till it was about 2/3 grown, and then sickened and died. This brought another protracted mourning season. Not that he felt the pecuniary loss so heavily, for that was never his disposition, but so strong and earnest were his attachments. John had been taught from earliest childhood to fear God and keep his commandments, and though quite skeptical, he had always by turns felt much serious doubt as to his future well-being, and about this time became, to some extent, a convert to Christianity, and ever after a firm believer in the divine authenticity of the Bible. With this book he became very familiar, and possessed a most unusual memory of its entire contents. Now some of the things I have been telling of were just such as I would recommend to you, and I would like to know that you had selected these out and adopted them as part of your own plan of life, and I wish you to have some definite plan. Many seem to have none, and others never to stick to any that they do form. That was not the case with John. He followed up with tenacity whatever he set about so long as it answered his general purpose, and hence he rarely failed in some good degree to effect the things he undertook. This was so much the case that he habitually expected to succeed in his undertakings. With this feeling should be coupled the consciousness that our plans are right in themselves. During the period I have named, John had acquired a kind of ownership to certain animals of some little value, but as he had come to understand that the title of minors might be a little imperfect, he had recourse to various means in order to secure a more independent and perfect right of property. One of these means was to exchange with his father for something of far less value. Another was by trading with other persons for something his father had never owned. Older persons have sometimes found difficulty with titles. From 15 to 20 years old, he kept most of his time working at the tanner and currier's trade, keeping bachelor's hall, and he officiating as cook, and for most of the time as foreman of the establishment under his father. During this period, he found much trouble with some of the bad habits I have mentioned, and with some that I have not told you of. His conscience urging him forward with great power in this matter, but his close attention to business and success in its management, together with the way he got along with a company of men and boys, made him quite a favorite with the serious and more intelligent portion of older persons. This was so much the case, and secured for him so many little notices from those he esteemed, that his vanity was very much fed by it, and he came forward to manhood quite full of self-conceit and self-confident, notwithstanding his extreme bashfulness. A younger brother used sometimes to remind him of this, and to repeat to him this expression, which you may somewhere find: "A king against whom there is no rising up." This habit so early formed of being obeyed rendered him in after life too much disposed to speak in an imperious or dictating way. From 15 years and upward, he felt a good deal of anxiety to learn, but could only read and study a little, both for want of time and on account of inflammation of the eyes. He, however, managed by the help of books to make himself tolerably well acquainted with common arithmetic and surveying, which he practiced more or less after he was 20 years old. At a little past 20 years, led by his own inclination and prompted also by his father, he married a remarkably plain but industrious and economical girl, of excellent character, earnest piety, and good practical common sense, about 1 year younger than himself. This woman, by her mild, frank, and more than all else, by her very consistent conduct, acquired and ever while she lived maintained a most powerful and good influence over him. Her plain but kind admonitions generally had the right effect, without arousing his haughty, obstinate temper. John began early in life to discover a great liking to fine cattle, horses, sheep, and swine, and as soon as circumstances would enable him, he began to be a practical shepherd, it being a calling for which in early life he had a kind of enthusiastic longing, together with the idea that as a business it bid fair to afford him the means of carrying out his greatest or principal object. I have now given you a kind of general idea of the early life of this boy, and if I believed it would be worth the trouble, or afford much interest to any good-feeling person, I might be tempted to tell you something of his course in after life, or manhood. I do not say that I will do it. You will discover that in using up my half-sheets to save paper, I have written 2 pages, so that one does not follow the other as it should. I have no time to write it over, and but for unavoidable hindrances in traveling, I can hardly say when I should have written what I have. With an honest desire for your best good, I subscribe myself, your friend, J. Brown. P.S. I had like to have forgotten to acknowledge your contribution and aid of the cause in which I serve. God Almighty bless you, my son. J.B. End quote. That's quite a letter. It seems to me like the kind of letter a psychologist could have a field day with. The most striking feature of the letter to me is how Brown talks about his child self in the third person, as if his current self is actually someone else. In the first paragraph, he mentions my entire acquaintance with him being Brown's own child self. It's almost like he wants to distance himself from his past self. His earliest memory that he speaks of is one of sin and punishment. At 4 years old, he stole some brass pins from a girl and was beaten for it. He doesn't say this explicitly in the letter, but you get the sense that he fully accepts that he deserved that punishment. You can see there a very Puritan attitude towards sin and punishment. And of course, Brown was descended from Mayflower colonists as well as American Revolution soldiers. One reason I call Brown an anomaly is that he has a foot in both camps of the Kansas Free State movement. Remember those 3 main categories of Kansas settlers we talked about in Part 1? You had the Missourians and other Southerners, then you had the moderate anti-slavery Northwesterners, and the radical abolitionist Immigrant Aid Society New Englanders. Well, Brown doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. He was obviously a Northerner, but while he had those Puritan New England roots, he also spent most of his formative years in the Northwest, in Ohio. He was also not what you'd call a wealthy elite, certainly not on the level of guys like Charles Robinson, Eli Thayer, Amos Lawrence, and the circles they ran in. But at the same time, unlike other Northwesterners who tended to be moderately anti-slavery, often due to economic or self-interested reasons, Brown was among the most radical of the radical abolitionists. And unlike Robinson, he had absolutely no interest in portraying himself publicly as a moderate for political reasons. If anything, he would have been insulted at the mere suggestion that he do so. As he said in his letter to Henry Stearns, Brown was born in the year 1800 and was already 54 years old when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. For a point of reference, he was 14 years older than Jim Lane and 18 years older than Charles Robinson. He was almost from an entirely different era than the one that existed in 1855. When he was born, the U.S. only had 16 states, and the Louisiana Purchase still had yet to be signed. Horwitz paints this picture of circumstances at the time of Brown's birth. Quote, in 1800, the year of Brown's birth in the thin-soiled hills of Connecticut, the United States was just entering its adolescence. The Constitution turned 13 that year. For the first time, a president took up residence in the newly built White House, and Congress convened on Capitol Hill. The young nation barely extended beyond the Appalachians. Its largest city, New York, had 60,000 people, equal to present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. In many respects, daily existence at the time of Brown's birth was closer to life in medieval Europe than modern-day America. Most people worked on farms and used wooden plows. Land travel moved at horse or foot speed on roads so awful that the carriage bringing First Lady Abigail Adams to Washington got lost in the woods near Baltimore. Crossing the ocean was a weeks-long ordeal. News wasn't new by the time it arrived. In this pre-industrial society of 5 million people, almost 900,000 were enslaved, and not only in the South. Though northern states had taken steps toward ending the institution, most of these measures provided for only gradual emancipation. Brown's home state had almost 1,000 slaves at the time of his birth, and New York 20 times that number. End quote. As far as I know, the letter I read a few minutes ago is the only detailed account that exists of Brown's early life. Brown doesn't continue his account past his early adulthood, but we'll continue the story here to explain how he came to be the militant abolitionist he's known as today. While still living in Ohio, he followed the lead of his father Owen in aiding runaway slaves who came through on the Underground Railroad. The remarkably plain woman he married at age 20 was 19-year-old Deontay Lusk. He still kept aiding runaway slaves, but as children started to come, he found other things to occupy his time. Brown's staunch Puritanism was on full display in his early years as a husband and father. Horowitz says, quote, during the first 4 years of their union, Brown and his wife had 3 sons. Like his father before him, Brown pioneered new territory, taking his wife and toddlers to a sparsely settled section of northwestern Pennsylvania. He cleared land, built a tannery, raised stock, and, like Owen, became a civic leader, founding a school and church and serving as the area's first postmaster. An inspired paternal ruler was how one of his neighbors described him, controlling and providing for the circle of which he was the head. The circle quickly grew to include 3 more children. Brown, raised by disciplinarians, became one himself, hewing to the Calvinist belief in the depravity of human nature. His firstborn, John Jr., was required to keep a ledger listing his sins and detailing the punishment due each. Unfaithfulness at work earned 3 lashes. Disobeying mother brought 8. The second-born, Jason, had a vivid dream about petting a baby raccoon that was as kind as a kitten, and described the encounter as if it had really happened. He was 3 or 4 at the time, and his father thrashed him for telling a wicked lie. 5-year-old Ruth muddied her shoes while gathering pussy willows, and then fibbed about how she'd gotten wet. Her father switched me with the willow that had caused my sin, she recalled. Corporal punishment was common at the time, but Brown dispensed the rod with a special vigor. He was determined to root out sin, not only in his offspring, but also in himself and others. When he was a young man, this compulsion to punish wrongs was primarily manifest in small acts of moral policing. Brown apprehended 2 men he encountered on the road who were stealing apples, and smashed a neighbor's whiskey jug after taking a few sips and deciding the liquor had dangerous powers. Despite his severity, Brown was beloved by his children, who also recalled his many acts of tenderness. He sang hymns to them at bedtime, recited maxims from Aesop and Benjamin Franklin, diligence is the mother of good luck, cared for his little folks when they were ill, and was gentle with animals. He warmed frozen lambs in the family washtub. Brown nursed his wife as well. Deontay came from a family with a history of mental illness, and not long after her marriage she began to exhibit signs of what relatives called strangeness. She also faltered physically, suffering from a difficulty about her heart, Brown wrote. End quote. Deontay would bear 7 children to Brown, starting with John Jr., born in 1821, about a year after their marriage. John Jr. was followed by Jason in 1823, Owen in 1824, Frederick in 1827, who died in infancy, Ruth in 1829, and a second Frederick in 1830, named after his deceased older brother. By the way, that's kind of a morbid fact I learned about this period while researching this series. Back in the day when infant mortality rates were a lot higher than they are now, it was actually fairly common for families to recycle names like the Browns did with Frederick. It wasn't just infant mortality that was high back then either. Mother mortality in childbirth was also common, and Deontay would fall victim to it in 1832 while giving birth to her 7th child, an unnamed son who also died in infancy, leaving Brown a widower with 5 surviving children. The 4 boys would later join their father in his Kansas abolition campaign. He wouldn't stay a widower for long, though. He hired a housekeeper after Deontay's death, and the housekeeper had a sister, Mary Day, who would sometimes come along to help. Brown and Mary apparently hit it off, and they married in 1833, less than a year after Deontay's death. Brown was 33 by then, and Mary Day was 16. Only 4 years older than Brown's oldest son, John Jr. Mary would bear Brown 13 more children over the course of their marriage. Horwitz says that Brown was, quote, a tireless worker and skilled at diverse trades, tanning, surveying, farming, cattle breeding, sheep herding, end quote. But unfortunately for him, Brown's skills did not translate to wealth. Horwitz continues, quote, but Brown's diligence and work ethic were repeatedly undone by his inability to manage money. This was a leitmotif of his earliest surviving letters, mostly to a partner in his tanning and cattle business. I am running low for cash again, Brown wrote Seth Thompson in 1828. I was unable to raise any cash towards the bank debt, he wrote in 1832. Then, later that year, unable to send you money as I intended. And in 1834, again, I have been utterly unable to raise any money for you as yet. In these and many other letters, Brown expressed regret for his financial straits, and blamed them on forces beyond his control: the weather, ill health, the monetary policies of President Andrew Jackson. Brown may also have been distracted by his budding concern for affairs other than business. It was in the early 1830s that he first wrote of his determination to help slaves. He also showed signs of a truculent and nonconformist spirit. Brown joined the Freemasons, but quickly fell out with the secret society amid accusations that Masons had murdered one of their critics in New York. Far from being cowed by the controversy, Brown openly proclaimed his opposition to the group and circulated the published statement of a Mason who claimed that he'd been selected to cut the throat of a brother who revealed the order's secrets. I have aroused such a feeling towards me, Brown wrote his father in 1830, as leads me for the present to avoid going about the streets at evening and alone. Brown knew his father would approve of his defiance, if not of the other measure he took. Owen was a committed pacifist. His son, a warrior at heart, acquired his first gun. End quote. There's a second reason I call Brown an outlier, or an anomaly. That is that I think he was literally on the extreme end of a bell curve. That bell curve being something like ideological commitment. One thing people will say about Brown is that he was a madman, or he was crazy, or delusional. The people who say that are usually the ones who don't like him, obviously. But here's the thing. Look, I might as well say this up front. I despise John Brown personally. I think he shows one of the worst examples of what can happen when a person is absolutely committed to heresy and truly follows it to its logical conclusion. But I don't think he was crazy. He was certainly deluded in some sense, in the sense that his values and religious beliefs, especially his ideas of sin and punishment, were all out of whack, informed as they were by Puritanism and Calvinism, as well as American Enlightenment ideals. But the idea of crazy, to me, doesn't just indicate wrong belief. It indicates something more than that. It indicates erratic or contradictory behavior. Picture somebody like King Saul from the Old Testament towards the end of his reign. He was tormented with an evil spirit and would have the future King David play the harp to soothe his mind. But then he would have fits of rage and hurl his spear at David while he played. This is 1 Kingdoms chapter 16, verses 14 to 23 in the Orthodox Study Bible. That book is called 1 Samuel in other Bibles. Quote, "But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servants said to him, 'Behold, an evil spirit from the Lord is tormenting you. Now let your servants speak before you, and let them seek for our Lord a man who knows how to play the harp. And it will come to pass when the evil spirit is upon you, he will play his harp, and it will be good for you and give you rest.' So Saul said to his servants, 'Indeed, seek out for me a man who plays skillfully and bring him to me.' Then one of his servants answered and said, 'Look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who understands playing on the harp, a prudent man, a man of war, wise in speech, handsome, and the Lord is with him.' Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, who is with the sheep.' And Jesse took a homer of bread, a skin of wine, and one young goat, and sent them by the hand of his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, 'Let David stand here before me, for he has found favor in my sight.' So whenever the evil spirit was upon Saul, David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become well refreshed, and the evil spirit would depart from him." End quote. Then a little bit later in chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, quote, "An evil spirit came from God upon Saul as he was resting in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp. And Saul sought to strike David with his spear, but David slipped away from him as he drove the spear into the wall. David fled and escaped." End quote. To me, that's what is meant by crazy. It's erratic, irrational behavior that isn't motivated by any clear purpose that can make sense to other people. Saul had grown increasingly paranoid about David's popularity with the people of his kingdom and the possibility that David might try to usurp him. But even that doesn't really hold up as a motive. It's true that David was popular, but he hadn't shown any desire to usurp Saul's throne. In fact, later on, while on the run from Saul's assassins, David is presented with the perfect opportunity to kill Saul and passes it up. What's more, he makes sure Saul knows he passed up a chance to kill him, as a way of demonstrating his loyalty. But even if it were true that David had ambitions of usurpation, Saul's act of throwing the spear still doesn't make sense. It wasn't exactly a well-planned assassination, right? It was an impulsive act of violence that David easily evaded. Add to that the fact that this, along with Saul's later attempts to kill David, only served to further increase David's popularity with the Israelites and decrease Saul's. So to me, Saul could be spoken of as crazy. John Brown, on the other hand, never showed that kind of erratic or irrational behavior as far as I can tell. His most apparently deranged actions, while certainly evil by any true Christian standard, I think can always be seen as being taken in service of a purpose that made some sense given his religious and ideological commitments. They certainly made sense to many other abolitionists of his time, even some of the less militant ones. So I think it's a mistake to call him crazy. And the reason I bring this up is that I think to call him crazy actually lets him off the hook somewhat. I mean, we use insanity as a defense in criminal cases, because our society holds the premise that if a person is mentally incapable of understanding the wrongness of their actions, that should be a mitigating factor in any crimes they've committed. Depending on the crime, maybe they get a reduced sentence, or maybe they're found not guilty entirely and sent to a mental institution instead of prison. I think Brown was perfectly sane and perfectly capable of understanding the morality of his actions, and for that reason should not be let off the hook with the crazy label. More importantly, I think to simply chalk Brown's evil actions up to insanity causes us to miss a more important point. And that's how broken theology and disordered religious commitments can lead a person down a destructive path. See, like I said, Brown was an outlier as far as his commitment to his religious and ideological principles. In that way, he could be understood as a microcosm of the Puritan spirit as a whole. Think of the most deeply held belief you have. If you're an Orthodox Christian, maybe that's the belief in God as elucidated in the Nicene Creed. If you're not Orthodox, maybe your church has some creed or statement of beliefs that you hold to. If you're not religious at all, maybe that's something like democracy or the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whatever it is, I ask you this. Would you be willing to die for that belief? Would you be willing to kill for that belief? Would you be willing to see your children killed for that belief? Would you be not just willing, but almost eager to see your nation and people torn apart in a bitter civil war for that belief? John Brown was willing to do just about anything for his belief in the abolition of slavery. Most people are not like this. Brown was an outlier, an anomaly. Tony Horwitz continues his account of Brown's life. By the way, the Garrison he refers to in this quote is William Lloyd Garrison. We talked about him in part 1. He was the editor of the Boston newspaper, The Liberator, and was famous for his inflammatory abolitionist rhetoric. But unlike Brown, he was a pacifist, or at least that's how he presented himself publicly. Horwitz says, quote, "The first sign of Brown's brewing militancy came in 1837, when a pro-slavery mob in Illinois killed an abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, and threw his printing press into the Mississippi. Garrison, who had narrowly escaped lynching 2 years before, disapproved of Lovejoy's arming himself in self-defense. Brown, at a church meeting called to protest Lovejoy's killing, lifted his right hand and declared, 'Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery.' Brown's father attended the same meeting and spoke in praise of Lovejoy. About this time, Owen also left his conservative church to join one affiliated with abolitionism. And he became an early trustee of Oberlin, a radical new college in Ohio that accepted blacks and women. One of Oberlin's first female graduates was Florella Brown, Owen's daughter by his second wife. John Brown also broke with his church in the bold fashion that would become his hallmark. During a revival, he was angered to see the congregation's few black worshippers confined to the back of the church. He escorted them forward to his own family's pew and took their seats in the back. Church deacons later reprimanded him. Brown manifested his independence in another, more covert way. Abolitionists created scores of societies in the 1830s and 1840s, from national organizations to local knitting circles. Brown joined none of them. Instead, one night in the late 1830s, he gathered his wife and 3 teenage sons by the fire and spoke of his determination to wage war on slavery. He asked who of us were willing to make common cause with him, and doing all in our power to break the jaws of the wicked and pluck the spoil out of his teeth, his eldest son wrote. "Are you, Mary, John, Jason, and Owen?" As each family member assented, Brown knelt in prayer and administered an oath, pledging them to secrecy and devotion to slavery's defeat. He later brought his younger children into this secret army, including a daughter who would accompany him to Virginia. But as imposing as Brown could be as a father, he wasn't a cult figure to his family, nor did he command automatic obedience from his offspring. To the contrary, they often found amusement in his stern and ceaseless efforts to inculcate his beliefs. During the family's twice-daily prayers, his son Salmon recalled, Brown would become dead to the world and to the pranks of his unregenerate boys, who slyly prodded each other with pins and trampled upon each other's toes to relieve the tension. None of Brown's sons adopted their father's Orthodox faith, and several openly challenged it, an apostasy that vexed him tremendously. But all 7 of his unregenerate boys who survived childhood would take up arms against slavery. They held firmly to the idea that father was right, Salmon recalled. Where he had led, we were glad to follow, and every one of us had the courage of his convictions. Brown's brothers, in-laws, and other kin would also lend support to his anti-slavery crusade. There was a Brown family conspiracy, his eldest son said, to break the power of slavery. Over the course of this decades-long struggle, Brown drew inspiration from a number of Old Testament figures, but the one he returned to most often was Gideon. Called on by God to save Israel from the wicked Midianites, Gideon gathered a small force and crept up on his army's vast camp in the dark. Then he blew his trumpet, and so did his men, raising their torches and crying, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The Midianites ran and cried and fled until their leaders were hunted down and slain. The story of Gideon embodied Brown's belief that a righteous band, boldly led, could bring divine wrath upon the wicked of the land. With God as his protector, he needed only a small tribe, beginning with the 4 family members he inducted by his hearth in the late 1830s. End quote. I forgot he says Orthodox faith in that quote. Obviously, he means small o orthodoxy and not the Eastern Orthodox Church, but it's kind of funny to me. Anyway, Brown moved his family back to Ohio in 1835 and got involved in land speculation. But that venture would end in disaster. The Panic of 1837 hit, among the first economic crises in U.S. history, and Brown was forced to sell off his land at disastrous losses. The troubles of the economic depression were compounded by his inability to manage money to begin with, and his situation spiraled fast. In 1841, Brown and 2 of his sons were arrested after a standoff with the local sheriff when, instead of vacating a property that had been foreclosed on, they holed up in the cabin with muskets threatening to fight it out. In 1842, Brown declared bankruptcy in desperation, and in 1843, even worse disaster struck when dysentery swept through his family. He lost 4 children that fall, including 3 on 3 consecutive days, the oldest being 9-year-old Sarah. In fact, Brown fathered a total of 20 children, 7 by Deontay and 13 by Mary, and of those 20, 9 died before the age of 10 years. Early death was incredibly common in this time, but that doesn't mean it hit Brown any less hard. From Horwitz, quote, Brown, though all too familiar with early death, had always taken losses exceptionally hard, beginning with his prolonged childhood mourning of pets and even of a marble. Burying 4 of his young flock in the fall of 1843 plunged him into a profound depression. It was a calamity from which father never fully recovered, John Jr. wrote. The family's impoverishment, which had necessitated moving to a crowded and possibly unsanitary log house, may have deepened the wound. I felt for a number of years, Brown later wrote in a letter to a young abolitionist, a steady, strong desire to die. But in the same letter, he expressed his undying commitment to the destruction of slavery. Certainly the cause is enough to live for, Brown wrote, and he was now rather anxious to live for a few years more. He knew he would endure hardness, as he had throughout his life. But I expect to effect a mighty conquest, even though it be like the last victory of Samson. End quote. I want you to remember those last couple of statements, the death wish and the Samson reference. In case you don't know, Samson was one of the judges of Israel from the book of Judges in the Old Testament. He was famous for his strength, as well as his Nazirite vow to never cut his hair. But he was betrayed by a woman, had his hair cut, was captured by his enemies, the Philistines, and had his eyes gouged out. His last victory that Brown refers to was when, blinded and chained between two pillars at a Philistine feast, Samson called on God for one last burst of strength, then pulled the pillars down, collapsing the house and killing himself along with all the Philistines present. But that'll become relevant later. For now, Brown tried to get his finances back on track with a new venture, moving his family to Springfield, Massachusetts in 1847 to try his hand at the wool trade. Like his past ventures, the wool trade didn't work out for him either, but living in Springfield did provide other benefits. From Horwitz, quote, "But if Springfield tested and found wanting Brown's acumen and dedication as a businessman, it proved an excellent place to pursue the true mission he believed he had from God. The city had a large population of free blacks, many of them fugitives from slavery, and it was a regular stop on the abolitionist circuit. Among those who visited Springfield was Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, orator, and writer who had become, alongside William Lloyd Garrison, the most prominent abolitionist in the country. Brown met Douglass in the winter of 1847-48 and invited him to his home, which the visitor described as extremely humble, with furnishings that would have satisfied a Spartan. Douglass also gave a vivid description of Brown as he appeared in his late 40s. Standing about 5'10", he was lean, strong, and sinewy, and straight and symmetrical as a mountain pine. He had a prominent chin, coarse dark hair, and eyes full of light and fire. The earliest surviving portrait of Brown, a studio daguerreotype, dates to the period of Douglass's visit. Brown's thin lips are pressed firmly together, forming a slash across his angular face. His deep-set eyes are piercing and hooded, his brow furrowed, his nose long and sharp. Dark, bristly hair crowns his forehead. Brown's pose is equally striking. His right hand is raised in oath, as if pledging allegiance to a secret fraternity. His left hand clutches a banner that bore the letters SPW. This stood for Subterranean Pass Way, shorthand for the radical scheme Brown had devised for slaves' liberation. He shared this nascent plan with Frederick Douglass after their dinner in Springfield. Brown pointed to a map of the Allegheny Mountains, which run diagonally from Pennsylvania into Maryland and Virginia and deep into the South. Filled with natural forts and caves, these mountains, Brown said, had been placed by God for the emancipation of the Negro race. He planned to use the Alleghenies as a base for guerrillas, who would make lightning raids on the farm valleys below and induce slaves to join them. As the insurgent army grew, it would run off the slaves in large numbers, sending them north along the mountain chain to freedom. Brown's main objective, he told Douglass, was to undermine slavery by rendering such property insecure. He also believed his mission would focus national attention on slavery. The two men debated the scheme until 3 a.m. Brown sought the black abolitionists' support. Douglass doubted the plan's feasibility. But he came away deeply impressed by the wool merchant's sincerity and commitment. Douglass had begun his own abolitionist career as a protege of Garrison's, but by the late 1840s he'd come to question whether pacifism and moral suasion were sufficient tools for slaves' liberation. He also bristled at the prejudice and condescension displayed by many white abolitionists. Brown seemed remarkably free of this. Though a white gentleman, Douglass wrote in his abolitionist weekly, The North Star, soon after his Springfield visit, Brown is in sympathy a black man, and as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery. End quote. In 1848, Brown looked for support from a man by the name of Gerrit Smith, another one of those wealthy New England philanthropists. Smith was a serial activist who had taken on the project of settling free blacks in upstate New York. But the settlers struggled due to the poor quality of the land as well as their inexperience in farming. Brown received 244 acres of land from Smith at a bargain price in exchange for his offer to settle there and help teach the blacks how to farm and raise livestock. Horwitz continues, quote, Smith was impressed by the idealistic wool merchant and deeded him 244 acres at $1 an acre. In the spring of 1849, Brown settled near Lake Placid, in the village of North Elba. That June, Richard Henry Dana, the author of 2 Years Before the Mast, was hiking in the Adirondacks when he stumbled on a log house and half-cleared farm, the Browns' temporary home. Dana joined the family of 9 for dinner. 2 black neighbors were also at the table. Brown called the Negroes by their surnames, with the prefixes of Mr. and Mrs., Dana observed. It was plain they had not been so treated or spoken to often before. The 1850 census listed a 23-year-old black laborer from Florida, a fugitive slave, living with the Browns. Many black farm families dwelled close by. Brown's oldest daughter, Ruth, a bonny, buxom young woman, Dana wrote, with fair skin and red hair, married a white neighbor, Henry Thompson, who would later join his father-in-law's abolitionist crusade, as would 2 of his brothers. End quote. During this time at North Elba, Brown started to show what I would consider straight-up neglect of his wife and children. He was still involved in the wool trade in Springfield and would frequently leave home to conduct business. Once he even sailed all the way to England on the chance that he'd be able to get better prices there for his wool, but that too failed disastrously. Meanwhile, the sickly Mary was trying to hold things together at home, besides dealing with the infant deaths of 2 of the 3 children she'd had since 1843. Finally, she left Ruth in charge of North Elba and went to seek treatment for a nervous disorder at an infirmary in Northampton, Massachusetts. Horwitz says, quote, Mary wrote John Jr. complaining that his father never believed there was any disease about me and had left her very little money. To extend her treatment, she pleaded with her stepson, If you can send me $20 or $25, I should like it. Mary also mentioned a lecture by Lucy Stone, an abolitionist and suffragist. I went to hear for the first time that I ever heard a woman speak, she wrote, and she liked her very well. After her water cure, Mary recovered somewhat, bore another son who died aged 3 weeks, and gave birth a 13th and final time when she was 38. The one surviving photograph of her during her marriage shows a woman with strong cheekbones, severe hair, and downturned lips, seated between 2 bilious-looking girls. End quote. Of course, while all this was going on in Brown's life, all those national events we talked about in Part 1 were moving along. The Mexican War, the California Gold Rush, the Compromise of 1850, and finally the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The older Brown sons jumped on the opportunity right away. Horwitz continues, quote, In the summer of 1854, Kansas fever took hold in drought-stricken Ohio, where John Brown's grown sons owned farms and orchards. John Jr. told his father that he'd decided to sell out and move west. Brown approved, expressing praise of any family member disposed to go to Kansas or Nebraska with a view to help defeat Satan and his legions. But he was unable to join in this laudable mission. I feel committed to operate in another part of the field, he wrote John Jr. on August 21st. End quote. The other part of the field he's talking about was North Elba, where he intended to settle permanently. Mary was pregnant for the 13th and final time. Brown himself was 54 years old, and this seemed like no time for an expedition to Kansas. But the siren song kept calling. 5 of the Brown sons moved their families to Kansas and settled near the Free State outpost of Osawatomie. John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Salmon. Their letters trickled into North Elba, detailing the exploits of the Missouri border ruffians, the harassment, the voter fraud, and intimidation. In May 1855, John Jr. wrote, quote, Every day strengthens my belief that the sword, the final arbiter of all the great questions that have stirred mankind, will soon be called on to give its verdict. End quote. Well, Brown couldn't resist answering a call like that. In June 1855, he packed his bags and left his wife at North Elba with 4 children, including a 9-month-old daughter, and embarked upon what he saw as his God-given destiny, his great crusade against slavery, which would write his name in the history books. He joined his sons around Osawatomie, and that's where he was in November when Charles Dow was shot and killed by Franklin Coleman outside Hickory Point, kicking off what would become known as the Wakarusa War. Boy, I did not plan on talking about John Brown for over an hour right at the beginning, but here we are. Anyway, as the Missouri militia dug in along the Wakarusa River in early December 1855, and the Free State militia prepared to defend their settlement, Charles Robinson's wife Sarah wrote the following, quote, "The men were at work on a part of the forts, while entrenchments were being thrown up on each side of Massachusetts Street. The soldiers were drilling through the center of the broad street. Ladies were standing in the doorways looking on, while little boys, having caught the general spirit of a resort to arms, were marching about in martial array, with feathers in their paper cocked hats and imitation guns. The howitzer has just arrived, and several men are guarding it in one of the lower rooms. Some ladies go in to look at the grape and bombshells." End quote. Even with the Missouri Army camped at the gates of the territory's primary Free State settlement, Robinson still held to his Fabian strategy. He was determined that, whatever happened, the Free State militia would stay on the defensive and the Missourians would have to make the first move. He was somewhat challenged in this by Jim Lane, who, as one of the few Mexican War veterans present, took charge of military matters as Robinson's second-in-command. Lane's speeches to the men were characteristically fiery, and it's possible Robinson was getting flashbacks of the trigger-happy Joseph Maloney from the Sacramento squatter riot of 1850. When Robinson spoke to the men, it was along these lines, quote, "Men of Lawrence and Free State men, we must have courage, but with it we must have prudence. These men have come from Missouri to subjugate the Free State men, to crush the Free State movement. They will wait at least for a plausible excuse before commencing to shed blood. This excuse must not be given them. If the Missourians, partly from fear and partly from want of a sufficient pretext, have to go back without striking a blow, it will make them a laughingstock. This is the last struggle between freedom and slavery, and we must not flatter ourselves that it will be trivial or short. These may be dark days, but the American people and the world will justify us, and the cause of right will eventually triumph." End quote. New York Herald correspondent Douglas Brewerton provides a glimpse into the Missouri camp during the standoff. He wrote the following, quote, "The man of 70 winters stood shoulder to shoulder with the youth of 16. He was pro-slavery to the backbone. With him, to hate abolitionists was to do God's service. So the old man was not only among the first to take the field himself, but literally carried out the assertion of the governor by bringing with him not only his son, but his grandson to join. Gentlemen, this here old firelock were carried by my father through our dark days of our revolution, the days that tried men's souls, as I heard a chap say when he were a-making a stump speech down in Arkansas. But I'll be—" Here the old man ripped out a very English oath and brought down the butt of the piece with a crash to the ground. "Yes, I'll be derned, gentlemen, if she were ever carried in a better cause than this." End quote. But despite Lane's best efforts, and despite the big talk of many in the Wakarusa camp, things stayed surprisingly calm, save for some sporadic, long-range picket fire between the camp and the town that caused no casualties. You have to remember, and I'll bring this up again and again as we move forward in this story, most of the men involved here were not soldiers and never had been. There were likely some Mexican war veterans, especially on the Missouri side, but they were the minority. You have to try to imagine what might have been going on in the heads of these men, especially the Missourians. For the Free Staters in Lawrence, defending the town against attack would have been one thing. Being the defender has to kind of simplify things a bit psychologically. You're not the one making the first move. If you're attacked, you'll respond to the attack. Being the attacker, on the other hand, would have been something else. In that case, it's up to your side to make the first move. That's got to be nerve-wracking, especially in a case like this where there's not actually a shooting war going on yet. Even in 1855, everybody was well aware that violence here could potentially spark a wider civil war across the nation. And if you're in the ranks of the attacking side that has the first move, maybe that thought gives you some pause. Besides that, you're talking about a bunch of loosely organized, mostly untrained men faced with the prospect of assaulting a prepared defensive position. Top that off with some exaggerated rumors about the capabilities of the Sharps rifle, and you might have some trouble motivating those men for such an attack. And that was just the first problem for the Missourians. Robinson had them in a real bind here. They didn't really have any good options, and whichever choice they made would be the wrong one. Robinson said that if they marched away without fighting, they'd be a laughingstock, and he was right. Just like the squatters along the Kaw River when Robinson's group arrived to stake out the town of Lawrence, if the pro-slave faction backed down now, they would show themselves as weak and unable or unwilling to uphold what they saw as the side of law and order. On the other hand, if they did attack, they'd be playing right into Robinson's Fabian strategy. They'd be forever tarred by the Northern press as the side that started the shooting war. And thousands more Northerners would flood into the territory in a tide that the South couldn't hope to match. So they couldn't retreat, and they couldn't attack. And yet they also couldn't exactly stay encamped on the Wakarusa forever. It might be tempting to say the right move would have been to not get into this situation in the first place, and I tend to agree. But once the Free State militia had openly defied Sheriff Jones' posse, that seems like it probably would have had a similar effect to retreating without a fight. They'd still be allowing the Free Staters to get away with what basically amounted to armed insurrection. So, faced with this predicament, the Missourians froze. They stayed where they were, and they didn't make an assault on the town. But the Wakarusa War wasn't completely without casualties. On December 6th, 3 Free State men in Lawrence decided they'd had enough of playing war and decided to go home. These were a pair of brothers, Thomas and Robert Barber, and their brother-in-law, Thomas Pearson. The Missourians, for the past several days before this, had been patrolling the roads leading into Lawrence, intercepting supplies and arresting men they suspected of heading into the town with intentions to join the militia. One of these patrols met with Pearson and the Barber brothers on their way out of town. The following quotes are from Thomas Goodrich's book, War to the Knife. Pearson writes, quote, "We followed the California road west for 3 miles or more when we turned off the highway to take a crossroad which led to the left towards our homes. Just before doing so, and while still in the California road, I saw a party of 12 to 15 mounted men to the right of the trail, and some half a mile or more distant, they appeared to be coming towards the California road. In a few minutes, I saw 2 men detach themselves from the main body and ride forward at a quicker gait, as if to cut us off. We were riding fast at the time, but immediately slackened our speed to a walk, so as to give these people no excuse for interfering with us. We had ridden about a mile in the crossroad, when these 2 men who had taken a shorter cut got ahead of us, and came in from the right, at a trot. One of them halted directly in front of us in the road, and within a few feet of our horses' heads. He was George Clark, a stout, thick-set man. He was riding a gray horse. His companion was riding a sorrel horse." End quote. Robert Barber continues the account. Quote, "After halting us, the rider of the gray horse asked, 'Where are you going?' My brother Thomas replied, 'We are going home.' He then asked us, 'Where are you from?' My brother answered, 'We are from Lawrence.' 'What is going on in Lawrence?' was the next question. 'Nothing in particular,' said my brother. 'Nothing in particular, hey?' replied the man. He then added, 'We have orders from the governor to see the laws executed in Kansas.' Thomas then asked, 'What laws have we disobeyed?' Upon hearing this, the rider of the gray horse raised his hand and pointed towards his party, at the same time exclaiming, "Then turn your horses' heads and go with us." My brother then said, "We won't do it." "You won't, hey?" said their spokesman, at the same time starting off with his horse so as to bring him on the right side of my brother. The man drew his pistol as he started. My attention was at that moment taken up with drawing my own pistol. As I was changing it into my right hand to fire, I saw the man on the gray horse discharge his pistol at my brother. End quote. And back to Pearson. Quote, "I saw Thomas settle down in his saddle as the pistol was discharged. I thought he was hit. The man on the sorrel horse fired immediately. The reports of the two pistols were almost simultaneous. Robert fired 3 times without success. I was trying, but without success, to draw my pistol. When I finally got it out, our opponents had wheeled and were galloping off towards their party. Thomas then said, 'Let us be off.' We started accordingly at the top of our horses' speed, the barbers riding almost in front of me, and I following in their rear." End quote. And back to Robert Barber. Quote, "After riding in this manner for about 100 yards, my brother said to me, 'That fellow shot me.' He smiled as he said so. I asked him, 'Where are you shot?' He pointed to his right side. I then remarked, 'It is not possible, Thomas.' To this he replied, 'It is,' at the same time smiling again. After uttering these words, he dropped his rein and reeled in his saddle. Seeing that he was about to fall, I caught hold of him by the left shoulder, grasping the loose overcoat which he wore. I held him thus for nearly 100 yards. I could then hold him no longer, and he fell to the ground. As he did so, I slipped from my horse. I bent over my brother and found that he was dead." End quote. Pearson got away, along with Robert Barber. Thomas Barber's body was found and returned to Lawrence the same day, and you can bet that Charles Robinson wouldn't pass up a thing like this. It just so happened that the very next day, December 7th, 2 notable newcomers showed up in Lawrence. The first was Governor Shannon. The Lawrence Free Staters had sent delegates to the Capitol at Shawnee Mission several days before to invite Shannon to come out and see for himself what was going on. Remember, Wilson Shannon had only been appointed governor in August and arrived in the territory in late September, so he'd barely even had time to get his bearings before the Wakarusa War broke out. Up to this point, he'd really only spent time with the official territorial government, which was pro-slavery, so it's likely he didn't exactly have a balanced picture of the situation. He was amazed at what he saw when he rode into the Missourians' camp. He writes, quote, "I found in the camp at Wakarusa a deep and settled feeling of hostility against the opposing forces in Lawrence, and apparently a fixed determination to attack that place and demolish it and the presses, and take possession of their arms. It seemed to be a universal opinion in the camp that there was no safety to the law and order party in the territory, while the other party were permitted to retain their Sharps rifles, an instrument used only for war purposes." End quote. Seems Missourians were proposing what you might call the first ever assault weapons ban in American history. From the camp, Shannon continued into Lawrence, where he saw the body of Thomas Barber laid out for public viewing in the newly built Free State Hotel. With the sobs of Mrs. Barber echoing in the background, Shannon met with Robinson to discuss what was to be done. But if Shannon was there to try to calm the situation, the second newcomer who arrived that day intended to do quite the opposite. I love the way Jay Monahan describes this in Civil War on the Western Border. He says, quote, "One wagon, hauled by a skeleton of a horse, contained 7 tall, angular giants, each holding a pole surmounted by a bayonet. A pistol and short navy sword protruded from each man's belt. The strangers were named Brown, Old John and his boys from Oswattomie Creek." End quote. The second newcomer was actually 7 newcomers. John Brown himself plus 6 of his sons. John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, Salmon, and Oliver. Brown immediately set about making every effort to put a spark to the current powder keg of a situation. Goodrich quotes a witness who said of Brown, quote, "From that moment he commenced fomenting difficulties in camp, disregarding the command of superior officers and trying to induce the men to go down to Franklin and make an attack upon the pro-slavery forces in camp there. The Committee of Public Safety were called upon several times to head off his wild adventure." End quote. Racing against the likes of Brown, as well as his counterparts on the Wakarusa who favored an immediate attack on Lawrence, Shannon worked furiously to defuse the situation. He organized a parley on December 8th involving Robinson and Lane on the Free State side and Senator David Atchison and Sheriff Jones on the pro-slave side. From Monahan, quote, "The governor asked Robinson and Lane to accompany him under a flag of truce to the enemy lines. Back on the Wakarusa, the army assembled for a parley, and after listening to the governor and his companions, agreed to go back to Missouri. Then Shannon returned to Lawrence and signed a treaty with the Free State generals, they agreeing not to resist the execution of any legal process, the governor agreeing not to call on residents of any other state to aid in the execution of the laws. Weasel words, for both agreements depended on definitions of terms. At best, the treaty was nothing but a stay of immediate hostilities. Neither reckoned with wily Jim Lane, who held a card in his sleeve to play against the governor at the first opportunity." End quote. The treaty they signed read as follows, quote, "Whereas there is a misunderstanding between the people of Kansas, or a portion of them, and the governor thereof, arising out of the rescue near Hickory Point of a citizen under arrest, and some other matters, and whereas a strong apprehension exists that said misunderstanding may lead to civil strife and bloodshed, and whereas it is desired by both Governor Shannon and the people of Lawrence and vicinity to avert a calamity so disastrous to the interests of the territory and the Union, and to place all parties in a correct position before the world. Now, therefore, it is agreed by the said Governor Shannon and the undersigned people of Lawrence that the matter in dispute be settled as follows, to wit, we, the said citizens of said territory, protest that the said rescue was made without our knowledge or consent, but if any of our citizens were engaged, we pledge ourselves to aid in the execution of any legal process against them, that we have no knowledge of the previous, present, or prospective existence of any organization in the said territory for the resistance of the laws, and that we have not designed, and do not design, to resist the legal service of any criminal process therein, but pledge ourselves to aid in the execution of the laws, when called on by proper authority, in the town or vicinity of Lawrence, and that we will use all our influence in preserving order therein. And we declare that we are now, as we ever have been, ready at any time to aid the governor in securing a posse for the execution of such process, provided that any person thus arrested in Lawrence or vicinity, while a foreign force shall remain in the territory, shall be duly examined before a United States district judge of said territory in said town, and admitted to bail, and provided further that Governor Shannon agrees to use his influence to secure to the citizens of Kansas Territory remuneration for any damages sustained or unlawful depredations, if any such have been committed by a sheriff's posse in Douglas County, and further that Governor Shannon states that he has not called upon persons residents of any other state to aid in the execution of the laws, and such as are here in this territory are here of their own choice, and that he has not any authority or legal power to do so, nor will he exercise any such power, and that he will not call on any citizen of another state who may be here. That we wish it understood that we do not herein express any opinion as to the validity of the enactments of the territorial legislature. Done at Lawrence, Kansas, December 8th, 1855. Signed, Wilson Shannon, C. Robinson, J. H. Lane. End quote. I think Monahan is right to say that legal is a weasel word in that treaty. I mean, part of what kicked off the conflict here in the first place was the fact that due to the widespread voter fraud in the elections, the Free State Party under Robinson was referring to the official territorial government as the bogus legislature, and were openly planning to form their own parallel government. In fact, even though the treaty explicitly denies expressing any opinion on the validity of the current government, just a few months from this point in the timeline, Robinson will be openly encouraging his supporters to defy the laws of the official government, even the ones that have nothing to do with slavery. So the question of what legal means here depends entirely on whose premises you accept. Before we get to what card Lane had up his sleeve, the next thing that happened was that Atchison had to desperately calm the more aggressive segment of his army, who were furious at the treaty that had just been signed and just about made an attack on their own. But before that could happen, Kansas Territory itself intervened. On the night of December 8th, the area was hit by a vicious winter storm, which ushered in what turned out to be one of the harshest winters in living memory in the territory. Goodrich quotes a Missouri militiaman who said, quote, "It came down with icy keenness and driving a snowy sleet. The wind blew almost a hurricane. Cold and more bitter grew the night, and the fires had to be put out, as the furious flames were blown about so as to endanger all of those near them." End quote. Well, that put a damper on any thought of fighting far more effectively than Atchison or anyone else ever could. And the Wakarusa War ended anticlimactically. Besides Dow and Barber, the only other casualties were 3 Southerners who died, according to Goodrich, quote, "one by his own sentry, another from a falling tree, and yet another in a drunken row." End quote. Or maybe you could say there was one more death in the Wakarusa War. The death of Wilson Shannon's reputation. Lane and Robinson still had their card to play. Monahan continues, quote, "Another storm lowered, and the Missourians on the Wakarusa showed no sign of striking their tents. Were they or were they not going home? During the evening, the Lawrence people congregated in the hotel again. Sentries still patrolled the town. Mrs. Ropes noticed that the governor appeared nervous, distinctly unhappy. He kept looking out the window into the driving storm. The Missourians were angry, he said, because he had interfered in the interest of peace. They had objected to his coming back to Lawrence from their camp, and in their anger might rush the town and lynch him. This fear gave Lane an opportunity to play his hidden card. A messenger came to the distraught governor stating that armed men were approaching the town. Would he give the people of Lawrence permission in writing to repel the invaders? The governor paused a moment and scratched his coarse gray hair. Here was a pretty state of affairs. He had come to enforce submission to the Missouri militia and was now asked to acknowledge sovereignty to the Free State outlaws. However, with his own life endangered, it seemed best to authorize the people of Lawrence to protect him. He signed the paper. Before morning, Shannon learned that no attack had come. He asked for the suppression of his signed statement, but it was too late. Multiple copies had been given to the ambitious young journalists, and stories of Shannon's capitulation were far on their way toward Eastern newspapers. The governor, in a great huff, wrote a long letter to President Pierce, claiming that he had been deceived, tricked, had not read the whole paper he signed in the urgency of the moment. All the excuses usually manufactured by a weak man with a strong imagination. Some said later that Lane got the governor drunk before the signing, and became pretty well intoxicated himself. Others maintained that the grim chieftain drank from a different and less potent bottle. As Lane never drank, it seems more likely that Shannon was the prey of the natural inclination to be swayed by the company around him." End quote. Goodrich quotes Shannon's own letter in his book. Shannon says, quote, "In the evening, I was invited to attend a social gathering of ladies and gentlemen of the town. There were but 2 rooms finished in the hotel, and were therefore very much crowded by the company assembled. The time was spent in the most friendly and social manner, and it seemed to be a matter of congratulation on every side that the difficulties so lately threatening had at length been brought to happy termination. In the midst of this convivial party, and about 10 o'clock at night, Dr. C. Robinson came to me, in a state of apparent excitement, and declared that their picket guard had just come in and reported that there was a large irregular force near the town who were threatening an attack, adding that the citizens of Lawrence claimed the protection of the executive, and to this end desired me to give himself and General Lane written permission to repel the threatened assault. He wished me to give him written authority so that it might appear that they were not acting against, but with the approbation of the territorial executive. With this view, amid an excited throng, in a small and crowded apartment, and without critical examination of the paper which Dr. Robinson had just written, I signed. Then in Goodrich's words, when the threatened assault failed to materialize, the drunken governor soon realized he had been hoodwinked into granting an air of legality to the rebel Free State government. According to Shannon, and then he quotes Shannon's letter again, it did not for a moment occur to me that this pretended attack upon the town was but a device to obtain from me a paper which might be used to my prejudice. I supposed at the time that I was surrounded by gentlemen and by grateful hearts, and not by tricksters who were seeking to obtain an advantage over me. I was the last man on the globe who deserved such treatment from the citizens of Lawrence. For 4 days and nights, and at the cost of many valuable friends whose goodwill I have forfeited by favoring too pacific a course, I had labored most incessantly to save their town from destruction and their citizens from a bloody fight. And back to Goodrich one more time. Deceived and duped by the one, reviled and cursed by the other, well-meaning Wilson Shannon had become an object of pity and contempt to all. End quote. An inauspicious start to the governorship of a man who, as it turned out, was not cut out for that job at all. Thomas Barber had really just wanted to go home, but Robinson made him into a martyr for the cause. He was buried with state honors on December 15th, and the poet John Greenleaf Whittier composed a poem in his honor. I won't read it here, but you can look it up if you want. It's called The Burial of Barber. The events in Lawrence brought out the personality difference between Lane and Robinson and contributed to their growing rivalry. While Lane hadn't gone as far as Brown in trying to stir up the Lawrence Free Staters to attack the Missourian camp, he was certainly less cautious in speech than Robinson. And for his part, Brown stalked off back to Osawatomie with his boys in disgust at the lack of any real fighting, but nonetheless feeling like a strong blow had been struck by the Free State movement. If the Robinson strategy depended on provoking the pro-slave faction to rash aggression, Brown, for one, wished they'd go ahead and get on with it, as he revealed in a letter to Mary in early 1856. From Horwitz, quote, I have no desire, he wrote Mary, to have the slave power cease from its acts of aggression. Their foot shall slide in due time. Brown was quoting a passage from Deuteronomy about the Lord's punishment to the wicked and unsuspecting. To me belongeth vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand. End quote. Everyone knew the Wakarusa Treaty was not anything like a permanent solution. It was at best a temporary truce until one side or the other saw a better opportunity to strike a blow than the one they'd had at Lawrence. But the story for the moment, more than the brewing violence, was the winter. On Christmas Day, 1855, Sarah Lawrence wrote in her diary, quote, thermometer ranging between 20 and 30 degrees below zero. The water freezes in the tumblers at breakfast, and everything eatable, or intended to be eaten, is frozen hard. The bread can only be cut as we thaw it by the fire, setting the loaf down and cutting one piece at a time. Potatoes, squashes, pumpkins, citrons, and apples are hard as rocks. End quote. Many of the New Englanders were shocked at the harshness of Kansas winters. In their efforts to get the people into the territory, agents of the Immigrant Aid Society had advertised Kansas as a much more temperate place where they could get away from this kind of thing. But now they found they had to deal with not only winters that were just as harsh as any they'd experienced in the Northeast, but also blistering hot summers, along with some of the most spectacular thunderstorms they'd ever seen, complete with wind, hail, lightning shows, and of course, tornadoes. The year before, in 1854, the territory saw a full-blown blizzard in mid-November. Then the temperature hit 86 degrees the day after Christmas, and well into January stayed, quote, warm enough for one to sit comfortably in the shade without coat or hat, end quote, only for the temperature to drop again toward the end of January. One Cyrus K. Holliday wrote to his wife back east, quote, "When I commenced this letter, I said there was a thunderstorm raging. It is now raining, hailing, snowing, blowing, thundering, and lightning all at the same time. A great country." End quote. No one seemed in much of a mood for fighting in the winter of 1855 to 56, but both sides went to their corners and bided their time. I've mentioned Douglas Brewerton before. He was a correspondent for the New York Herald and was a notable exception to the general trend of Northeastern newspapermen. After witnessing the standoff on the Wakarusa, he correctly saw what was coming and was less eager to bring it about than most of the media. He wrote, quote, "Kansas Territory has already been the theater of too many windy battles, in which words, bad words, harsh words, devilish words, have been rattled down like hailstones, night after night and day after day, by interested talkers upon either side, who didn't care a brass farthing whether the true interests of the people went to pandemonium or not. Would to God that this great country had some vast lunatic asylum, located amid the wilds of the Rocky Mountains, where tried and convicted demagogues from all quarters of the Union could find a home. Let the citizens of the United States take it to heart that this disturbance in Kansas means something. When Kansas bleeds, Georgia must open her veins, and Massachusetts too. For when this comes to pass, it requires no prophet to foretell a struggle which will crimson alike the Missouri and the Hudson." End quote. Robinson wasn't about to let warnings like that stop him from pressing on with his plans for a free state government in the territory. Elections were held January 15th, and Robinson was elected governor and Lane the territory's U.S. senator. Despite the cold, at least one group of Missouri militia, known as the Kickapoo Rangers, tried to interfere with the election at Easton, which led to what was probably the most brutal incident yet in the territory. The election at Easton had been rescheduled for January 17th, and this time, when the Kickapoo Rangers rode in, the Free Staters fought back. The Rangers retreated after a brief gunfight that left one of them dead. They weren't done, though, and the next day they set upon a group of 8 Free Staters as they rode home in a wagon. The Rangers captured the 8 men and took them back to Easton. They weren't quite sure what to do next, but their blood was up after losing one of their comrades the day before. This is from a New York Tribune correspondent quoted in War to the Knife. By the way, the Brown he'll refer to here is Reese Brown, no relation to John Brown. Quote, "The prisoners were taken back to Easton, but Brown was separated from them and put in an adjoining building. A rope was purchased at the store and was shown to the prisoners with the intimation that they should be hanged with it. It was fiercely discussed for hours what should be done with them, and meanwhile liquor was drank pretty freely. Unwilling that all of these men should be murdered, the captain allowed the other prisoners to escape. Then followed a scene of atrocity and horror. Captain Brown had surrendered his arms and was helpless. When they began to strike him, he rose to his feet and asked to be permitted to fight any one of them. He challenged them to pit him against their best man. He would fight for his life. But not one of the cowards dared thus to give the prisoner a chance. Then he volunteered to fight 2, and then 3, but it was in vain. These men, or rather demons, rushed around Brown and literally hacked him to death with their hatchets. One of the Rangers, a large, coarse-looking wretch named Robert Gibson, inflicted the fatal blow. A large hatchet gash in the side of the head, which penetrated the skull and brain many inches. Brown fell, and his remorseless enemies jumped on him while thus prostrate or kicked him. Desperately wounded though he was, he still lived, and as they kicked him, he said, "Don't abuse me. It is useless. I am dying." It was a vain appeal. One of the wretches stopped over the prostrate man, and with a refinement of cruelty exceeding the rudest savage, spit tobacco juice in his eyes. And then Goodrich continues. "God damn you, I want to see you gasp your last before I leave you," snarled one of the attackers as he delivered another sharp kick. Some in the crowd soon took pity and tried to bind the victim's wounds. With brains oozing from his skull, however, Brown's case was hopeless, and the belated rescuers opted to carry the dying man home to his wife. He was not able to tell us much about his cruel treatment, a mourning Martha Brown wrote her father, He said they beat him like a dog. He said, "I am not afraid to die. If I have done wrong in any way, I hope God will forgive me. I die in a good cause. I am sorry to part with you and our little children, but I want you to meet me in heaven." Hardly had the news from Easton been received when word came down from Atchison County that a pro-slavery settler there had been severely beaten and his leg nearly hacked away by axe-wielding Free Staters. End quote. As the weather warmed in the spring and the snow thawed, it seemed likely that full-scale hostilities would commence again in earnest. Amos Lawrence reassured Robinson by letter that the Fabian strategy should be stuck to. The northern press worked overtime to attract a new springtime wave of settlers into the territory, while Atchison and other Missourians called for aid from the south. President Pierce issued impotent and ineffectual pleas to the citizens to be civil to each other, and Governor Shannon was pretty much nowhere to be seen after the debacle at the end of the Wakarusa War. Southerners answered Atchison's call in the spring of 1856. Many Missourians, including Atchison and John Stringfellow, felt like the tide was turning in favor of the pro-slave faction in Kansas and that the Yankee immigrants would be forced to either live with slavery in the new state or go back home to New England. The Yankees weren't slouching on immigration either, but they had a problem. The last leg of their route to Kansas went up the Missouri River, directly through the heart of Missouri. And if their reception by the Missourians in 1854 had been surprisingly friendly, things were different now. By some accounts, the river was functionally blockaded to Yankees at this point. Many steamboat captains just wouldn't take them on board. There were also reports trickling back east of the reception of some New Englanders who did manage to make it into the territory. Remember the Reverend Pardee Butler? He was the loudmouth who was run out of Atchison the previous year and flatly told if he ever came back he'd be hanged. Well, guess what? He came back to Atchison in April of 1856. He had another run-in with the same Robert Kelly he had had words with last time. I mean, the guy must have had a death wish, but to everyone's surprise, he escaped hanging again, just like last time with the sympathetic help of Kelly. Instead, something more comical happened. Butler writes, quote, "I was dragged into a grocery, and there surrounded by a company of South Carolinians. They yelled, 'Kill him! Kill him! Hang the blank abolitionist!' One of their number bristled up to me and said, 'Have you got a revolver?' I answered, 'No.' He handed me a pistol and said, 'There, take that and stand off 10 steps, and blank, I will blow you through in an instant.' I replied, 'I have no use for your weapon.' The fellow was furious, but his companions dissuaded him from shooting me, saying they were going to hang me. They pinioned my arms behind my back and obtained a rope. They dragged me into another building and appointed a moderator, and got up a kind of lynch law trial. Kelly told his story. I rose to my feet and calmly and in respectful language began to tell mine. But these men savagely gagged me into silence by rapping my face, choking me, pulling my beard, jerking me violently to my seat, and exclaiming, 'Damn you, hold your tongue.'" End quote. And then a little later, after he was spared from hanging, Butler continues, quote, "One little dark-visaged, thin-featured, black-eyed South Carolinian, as smart as a cricket, and who seemed to be the leader of the gang, was particularly displeased. 'Damn me,' he said, 'if I am come all the way from South Carolina, and having spent so much money to do things up in such milk-and-water style as this.' They stripped me naked to the waist, covered my body with tar, and then, for the want of feathers, applied cotton wool. They tossed my clothing into my buggy, put me therein, accompanied me to the suburbs of the town, and sent me naked out upon the prairie. The first mob that sent me down the Missouri River on a raft were courteous gentlemen compared with this last one. When I was towed out into the middle of the stream, I do not remember to have heard a word spoken by the men on shore. This last mob, when they left me on the border of the town, shrieked and yelled like a pack of New Zealand cannibals. I adjusted my attire about me as best I could, and hastened to rejoin my wife and 2 little ones on the banks of the Stranger Creek." End quote. Despite the blockade of the river, many Yankees were motivated enough to come anyway. They would either just try to keep their head down and keep their abolitionist sympathies to themselves long enough to make it into the territory, or take a longer overland route through Iowa and Nebraska. When they came, they'd want to be armed, and the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was on the case, along with numerous new immigrant aid societies springing up in other states, modeled on Eli Thayer's in Massachusetts. Beecher was one of the first to take an offering in his church to fund the purchase of Sharp's rifles for new immigrants, and to avoid their confiscation by Missouri authorities on the way into Kansas, he shipped them in crates marked Bibles, and it's during this time that the Sharp's rifle earned the nickname Beecher's Bibles. If Robinson had intended to provoke a response from the Missourians, his plan seemed to be working, maybe a little too well at this point. But we should know Robinson well enough by now to know that he didn't know how to do anything but escalate. From Goodrich, quote, "Even as the explosive national situation escalated, the rebels of Kansas showed no signs of abandoning their illegal government. Indeed, with renewed vigor, the outlaws pressed ahead. While the Free State Legislature met in March at Topeka, in defiance of both federal and territorial authorities, the newly elected governor, Charles Robinson, drew up his plan of attack. To bring the pro-slavery government to its knees, Robinson urged his followers to resist any territorial officer trying to enforce the laws. Additionally, taxes were to be withheld, courts disrupted, and judges harassed and intimidated. To avoid a confrontation with the U.S. government and thereby jeopardize the propaganda war, federal troops acting as posses for local officials were to be simply evaded, not resisted." End quote. The other facet of Robinson's plan was the Topeka Constitution. Drafted in October and approved in December by a vote among the territory's Free State Party, it would be the focal point of Kansas' first bid for statehood. After the meeting of the Free State Legislature in early March, Robinson and Lane set off for Washington with the Constitution in their pockets. Their sales pitch to the U.S. Congress would be that the principle on which the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been based in the first place was popular sovereignty. And, well, here was their evidence that the people of the territory wanted it to become a free state. So those who had supported the act on that basis should also support the passing of this Constitution. The obvious problem was that, of course, as far as the federal government was concerned, Robinson had no legal authority in the territory at all, let alone authority to pass a state constitution. It was very obvious to anyone living in the territory that there was nothing popular about this constitution. It was drafted and approved entirely by the Free State Party only, who were still a minority in the territory. Even so, the U.S. House of Representatives approved the Organic Act that would have brought Kansas into the Union as a free state. The Senate would be a tougher sell. From Monahan, quote, "Then Lane turned to the Senate, which was controlled by the administration. Astutely, the grim chieftain consulted ancient Lewis Cass, veteran Democratic senator who had originated the doctrine of squatter sovereignty. Cass and Lane had both voted for the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and now, in all fairness, wanted Kansas admitted under a free state constitution, since the squatters willed it. Cass agreed to introduce an enabling act. Republican William H. Seward, the challenger of the South, spoke on April 9, 1856, for immediate acceptance. Senator Douglas objected. He strode out on his short legs, Websterian forehead wrinkled with emotion, to defend the administration and make one more attempt to hold the Democratic Party together. Many objections to an enabling act at this time could be made. Kansas had insufficient population for statehood. Let the much-publicized Southern aid companies send their immigrants to Kansas and then follow the will of the squatters. Valid objections, certainly more justifiable than Pierce's discharge of Reeder to appease the Atchison faction. However, Douglas went one step further. He questioned the memorial's genuineness. Slapping the document with the back of his pudgy hand, he accused Lane of bringing a partially forged document. A vote was taken on the Kansas memorial, and the state was denied admission under the Topeka Constitution. Lane immediately challenged Senator Douglas to a duel, which Douglas declined as coming from one of inferior station. Lane was deeply insulted, and when the grim chieftain resolved to get even with a man, he usually succeeded." End quote. So the first bid for statehood failed, and Robinson and Lane were back in Kansas by mid to late April, just in time for the next spark to set off a second attack on Lawrence by Missourians. If Robinson's followers were determined to resist, men like Sheriff Jones were just as eager to enforce the laws anyway, despite the resistance. Now, Sam Jones is a hard guy to get a read on from the sources I've seen. I haven't said much about his character thus far, and that's kind of on purpose because I really can't say much for sure about what he was like. From what I've seen, this seems to be a case of how he's characterized depends more on who's telling the story than anything else. And just for a couple quick examples, Frank Wilson Blackmar, who's a clear pro-Robinson, pro-abolitionist partisan, says this about Jones while describing the arrest of Branson the previous November. Quote, Jones appears to have been glad to have an opportunity to arrest a Free State man, as he was certainly a pro-slavery sympathizer who had helped in the elections against the Free State cause, and was especially bitter against the town of Lawrence. End quote. And then a little later, after Branson is rescued, quote, While Jones was disappointed at the loss of his prisoner in such an ignominious way, he doubtless would have been glad had such a rescue occurred in Lawrence, so that he might have had an excuse for the destruction of the town. End quote. Thomas Goodrich, on the other hand, describes Jones this way, quote, Described by his enemies as a tall, muscular, athletic loafer, a man who seldom looks those with whom he is conversing full in the face, to friends the sheriff was high-minded, honorable, and brave. Rather a fine-looking young man, offered a neutral observer. Whatever he may have seemed to others, Sam Jones was, in fact, a tenacious, serious-minded law officer who was destined to do his duty, regardless of the consequences. End quote. So I'm not really sure what to think of Jones, which is why I've kept my descriptions of him pretty neutral and just stuck to what things he actually did, and I'll continue to do that. Ever since Branson's rescue by the Free State Militia the previous November, Jones had been looking for an opportunity to arrest the militiamen who had challenged his posse, especially Sam Wood, who he considered to be the ringleader. He heard Wood was in Lawrence, and on April 19th, walked into town to arrest him. When told he was under arrest, Wood simply said he didn't recognize the authority of the sheriff of Douglas County and walked away. When Jones tried to follow, he was mobbed by a crowd of Free Staters and Wood got away. Jones came back the next day with a posse of 4 men and the same thing happened again. A mob swarmed the posse and protected Wood, and the sheriff left again without making his arrest. I'll let Goodrich pick up the account from there. Quote, Several days later, Sam Jones entered Lawrence for yet a third time. On this occasion, however, a file of U.S. dragoons under the command of Lieutenant James McIntosh came along as escort. Wrote Lieutenant McIntosh, now quoting McIntosh, From that time until sundown, he succeeded in arresting 6 of the offending individuals. While making these arrests, a large crowd was assembled in the streets, and although no resistance was made or violence resorted to, public excitement was great, and Mr. Jones and the territorial government were freely and bitterly denounced. About sundown, the sheriff having pointed out to me a room for the prisoners, I marched them to it, and placed my tents immediately in rear of the house. I at once placed 2 sentinels in the room with the prisoners, and 1 walking around outside of the house. I cautioned Mr. Jones and advised him to sleep in the same house occupied by the prisoners, where he would be under the protection of my guard. Mr. Jones, apparently not apprehending danger, came to my tent during the evening, and after being seated a while, I asked him to give me a drink of water, and I went with him to a barrel near the house for the purpose of getting it, and while standing at the barrel, a shot was fired from a crowd of about 20 persons. Mr. Jones immediately said, I believe that was intended for me. But having heard several other shots during the evening, which I thought were fired in the air, I told him I thought he was mistaken. He then returned to my tent. In about 5 minutes I went to the tent, when Mr. Jones said, That was intended for me, for here is the hole in my pants. Greatly incensed at this cowardly act, I immediately joined the crowd, and while speaking to them, I heard another shot, and at the same time some of my men exclaimed, Lieutenant, the sheriff is dead. I went to the tent immediately, and found Mr. Jones lying upon the floor, and saw that he was still alive. Back to Goodrich. While the victim rolled on the ground in agony, shouting Free Staters nearby beat pots and pans to the tune of "Let the Union Slide." The sheriff was severely, though not mortally, wounded, but news of his assassination caused a violent chain reaction along the western border. Shrieked the Atchison squatter sovereign, "The abolitionists in open rebellion! Sheriff Jones murdered by the traitors! Shot down by the thieving paupers!" End quote. Well, a move like that was more than Robinson had bargained for. According to his strategy, it was supposed to be the pro-slave faction that committed the acts of aggression against the passively resisting Free Staters. But sometimes when you create a monster, like Robinson had done here, things can get out of hand in a hurry. And that's exactly what was about to happen. This would not be like Sacramento, where things just kind of blew over after a riot and a quick gunfight and a visit from the lieutenant governor. Because unlike the Sacramento squatter conflict, the conflict in Kansas was tied into the larger political issue currently dividing the nation, and partisans on both sides had a vested interest in keeping it going. Robinson tried to do damage control by denouncing the shooting, but it was ineffective to say the least. The pro-slave side saw this as crocodile tears from Robinson and his followers, and understandably so. I mean, after all, Robinson had been openly calling for resistance to the territorial government, even if he hadn't meant for it to go as far as attempted murder of the sheriff. I don't know if this is true or not, but the rumor was even spread that Robinson claimed that Sheriff Jones had staged the attempt himself and had one of his friends shoot at him in order to frame the Free State Party for attempted murder. The reaction from the pro-slave faction was swift and just as aggressive as you'd expect. John Stringfellow of the Atchison Squatter Sovereign wrote, quote, "We are now in favor of leveling Lawrence and chastising the traitors there congregated, should it result in the total destruction of the Union." End quote. As the Missouri militia organized itself again, Judge Samuel D. Lecompte issued subpoenas for the court appearances of the most prominent Free State leaders: Lane, Robinson, George Washington Brown, no relation to John Brown, and ex-governor Andrew Reeder, by now a full-blown member of the Free State Party. Lane fled the territory to avoid arrest. Robinson tried to flee as well, but was caught on a steamboat at Lexington, Missouri, and brought back to Leavenworth, where he was held under arrest. Brown was also caught and arrested just over the Missouri state line at Westport. Reeder opted to hide out in the American Hotel in Kansas City to avoid arrest. The effect of all that was that this time, when the Missouri militia marched against Lawrence for the second time, the Free State citizens of the town were basically without leadership. Meanwhile, 35 miles southeast of Lawrence, near the Missouri border, more trouble was brewing near Osawatomie. There was a small settlement on the Pottawatomie Creek called Dutch Henry's Crossing, and it had been established as a trading post by a German immigrant named Henry Sherman. Dutch Henry. Sherman was a pro-slavery man, and his trading post was also a pro-slavery outpost in the area, as a counterbalance to the nearby Free State bastions of Osawatomie and the Brown family settlement, by now known as Brown's Station. In April, a new judge was sent by the pro-slavery government to Dutch Henry's Crossing to hold court. It was believed in the area that he would issue warrants for the arrest of the Browns, who had been following Robinson's guidance to the letter about defying the laws of the pro-slavery government. The potential for arrest warrants did nothing to deter Brown, who brought his local militia unit, the Pottawatomie Rifles, to sit in on a court session at Dutch Henry's Crossing. Brown presented to the judge, in writing, a pledge by himself and his militia unit to, quote, "resist by force any attempt to enforce pro-slavery laws." End quote. That's from Tony Horwitz. The judge did nothing about this, and the Browns were quickly gaining local notoriety on both sides of the divide. In May, as the Missouri militia marched into the territory following the attempted murder of Sheriff Jones and the arrest of the Free State leaders, a unit from Alabama under Major Jefferson Buford camped at Dutch Henry's Crossing on their way to Lawrence. They were some 400 strong, and even though they were just passing through for a different target this time, the experience of having so many armed men camped within easy striking distance made very clear to the Free State settlers of Osawatomie and Brown Station their own vulnerability. Now let Goodrich explain the situation in Lawrence as the pro-slavery militia approached. Quote, "With their leaders either captives or flying fugitives, the Free Staters of Lawrence watched as the pro-slavery circle closed tighter and tighter. Since the shooting of Sheriff Jones, Southern patrols had scoured the land, seeking victims. Divulged one witness," now quoting the witness, "camps were formed at different points along the highways and on the Kansas River, and peaceful travelers subjected to detention, robbery, and insult. Men were stopped in the streets and on the open prairie, and bidden to stand and deliver their purses at the peril of their lives. Cattle, provisions, arms, and other property were taken whenever found, without consent of the owners. Men were choked from their horses, which were seized by the marauders, and houses were broken open and pillaged of their contents." Back to Goodrich. "On May 15th, a band of border ruffians surrounded the village of Benicia, 7 miles upriver from Lawrence. I now want to give you a piece of advice," the leader warned after the Northerners had been herded into a cabin. Now quoting the leader, "You have been offering resistance to the laws of the territorial legislature. The President has declared it legal. Congress has declared it legal, and resistance to those laws is treason. What did you come here for? Why did you not go to Minnesota or Nebraska? It is not half settled, and is as good country as this. But no, you must come here. You want to get the whole of the territory. This territory belongs to the South, and by God, the South will have it. God damn you, if you are ever caught here again, you shall be strung up. Go to Nebraska, damn you. You have no right in Kansas." Back to Goodrich. 4 days later, near Blanton's Bridge on the Wakarusa, a young Free Soiler was mortally wounded by rifle fire when he failed to halt as ordered. On the following day, near the same spot, a comrade was shot through the head and also killed. As the violence spread and a showdown neared, South Carolinian Axala Hoole scratched out a tension-filled letter from his cabin at Douglas. Now quoting Hoole, "While I am writing, guns are firing in the camps of the different companies of soldiers who are gathering to attack Lawrence. They are shooting in every direction. I expect before you get this, Lawrence will be burnt to the ground. I don't think that they will show any fight, though they are preparing. But I hear they are very much frightened and have sent to the governor for protection." End quote. Without their leadership, the citizens of Lawrence changed their tune from the defiant stance they'd taken under Robinson. In their petition to Governor Shannon, they wrote, quote, "We now declare our willingness and determination, without resistance, to acquiesce in the service upon us of any judicial writs against us by the United States Marshal for Kansas Territory, and will furnish him a posse for that purpose, if so requested. We declare ourselves to be order-loving and law-abiding citizens, and only await an opportunity to testify our fidelity to the laws of the country, the Constitution, and the Union. We ask protection of the constituted authorities of the government, declaring ourselves in readiness to cooperate with them." End quote. This is a moment where it's kind of fascinating to me how it plays out. It's a very similar but different situation from the one last December. That time, the Free Staters had had leadership, and they'd been prepared to defend themselves. This time, all their leaders were either in jail or fled from the territory. On top of that, there was no influx of Free State reinforcements to Lawrence like there had been last time. It seems without the resolve of a guy like Robinson in charge, the remaining citizens figured that calling for reinforcements would only make the town look more guilty for the attempt on Jones' life, and they wanted to maintain as much of an appearance of innocence as they could. So when some 800 Missouri militiamen marched into Lawrence on May 21st, they met with basically no resistance at all. And this has to be a strange situation from their perspective too, right? I mean, many of these men, if not basically all of them, had been involved in the standoff during the Wakarusa War, when Lawrence did resist, and I'm sure they would have expected just as much resistance this time around. But when they showed up and there was no resistance, that would be almost like throwing a punch into empty space when you thought there was somebody's face there. It would be kind of confusing. I can almost picture these guys all keyed up for a fight, just waltzing into town and realizing there's nobody to stop them, and just looking at each other like, what do we do now? Again, remember that most of these men were not soldiers, and officially there wasn't even a war going on. If there was a war going on already, then at least the objective would be simplified. There might be an enemy supply depot to loot or burn or something, a bridge to blow up, something of military value that you could destroy. But with a lack of any clear purpose in coming here other than a somewhat vague desire to punish the Free State movement, what they ended up doing was the kind of thing that, while it might have felt cathartic in the moment and seemed like a win at the time, in the long term it was really just another giant blunder, just like the voter fraud in 1854 and 55. The first thing the Missourians did was occupy Mount Oread first thing in the morning. And Sheriff Jones, now recovered from his wound, rode down from the hill, found whatever prominent citizens were left in town, and demanded from them that the citizens surrender their weapons, or they would fire on the town with cannon from their commanding position. At this point, there was nothing to be done but comply, and the howitzer was surrendered, along with several smaller artillery pieces and many Sharps rifles and other small arms. Once the town was disarmed, the rest of the pro-slavery army marched down the hill and into town. Jones picked out the Free State Hotel as the first target, while David Atchison addressed the army. Quote, "Boys, this day I am a Kickapoo Ranger, by God. This day we have entered Lawrence with Southern rights inscribed upon our banner, and not one damned abolitionist dared to fire a gun. Now, boys, this is the happiest day of my life. We have entered that damned town and taught the damned abolitionists a Southern lesson that they will remember until the day they die. And now, boys, we will go in again with our highly honorable Jones and test the strength of that damned Free State Hotel and teach the Emigrant Aid Company that Kansas shall be ours. Boys, ladies should, and I hope will, be respected by every gentleman. But when a woman takes upon herself the garb of a soldier by carrying a Sharps rifle, then she is no longer worthy of respect. Trample her under your feet as you would a snake. If one man or woman dare stand before you, blow them to hell with a chunk of cold lead." End quote. Whatever else you might say about this raid, I will at least give the Missourians this. They knew who their prime enemy was. Once Atchison released the army to start their plunder, the first places targeted were the two newspaper offices, the Kansas Free State and the Herald of Freedom. The owner of the Free State Hotel, Shaler Eldridge, described the scene as the printing offices were attacked. Quote, "The ruffians ascended the stairs cautiously, as if fearing an ambuscade, but once in the room they vied with each other in the work of destruction. The press and fixtures were broken up with axe and sledgehammer. Files and exchanges, with a 6-month stock of paper and a half-printed edition of the Free State, were tossed through the windows into the street, and scattered by the winds over the prairie for a mile around. Cases of type were carried to the river and thrown in. Boxes of books, constituting a library of 300 volumes, were hacked to pieces with sabers, and when the destruction was complete, the company marched back, each member carrying a mutilated book on the point of his bayonet. Another company entered the office of the Herald of Freedom, and the work of destruction began. Everything pertaining to the office was reduced to complete ruin. While the destruction of the printing offices was going on, a detail was engaged in removing the furniture from the hotel." End quote. The Eldridge family was given 2 hours to evacuate their possessions from the Free State Hotel. And meanwhile, a cannon was rolled up and pointed at it. When the 2 hours were up, Atchison himself aimed and fired the first shot. But you have to remember, the Aid Society's original strategy had been to establish Free State outposts in Kansas and hold out against the pro-slavery Missourians, and with that in mind, the hotel had been built as not only a travel stop and place for social gatherings, but as a fortress. It was basically a concrete blockhouse, and proved harder to destroy than Atchison or his men anticipated. Eldridge continues his account. Quote, Atchison claimed the honor of directing the first shot, but being somewhat unsteady, presumably from indulging too freely in the contents of the hotel cellar, he aimed too high, and the ball passed over the top of the building, and, screaming through the air like a steam whistle, lit in the western portion of the town. Some 30 shots were fired more accurately, producing no more effect than perforating the concrete walls. Despairing to destroy it in this way, 2 kegs of powder were placed in the basement and exploded, but produced no serious effect. Piles of paper from the printing offices were then brought in and fired, when soon the whole interior was ablaze, the flames bursting through the windows and shooting through the roof. While the flames were at their height, Sheriff Jones, who had been all the while complacently watching the destruction, raised himself in his saddle and addressed his posse. Now this is Eldridge quoting Jones. Gentlemen, this is the happiest day of my life. I determined to make the fanatics bow before me in the dust and kiss the territorial laws. I have done it, by God. You are now dismissed. And back to Eldridge. The dismissal of the posse was accepted by them as an invitation to plunder. End quote. And plunder they did. The hotel ended up gutted by the fire, but the exterior concrete walls stayed intact. Now let Goodrich wrap up the account of what became known as the sacking of Lawrence. Quote, although several shouting officers tried to halt the pillage, they were not successful. Stores, stables, and vacant homes were entered and their contents stolen. Some returning residents tried, without much luck, to save their property. I saw a young man, one witness later wrote. A ruffian came up to him and demanded his Sharp's rifle and revolver. Said he, I haven't a rifle, and my revolver I bought and paid for, and you can't have it. We'll see, you goddamn son of a bitch, whether I'll have it or not. At the same time, calling 5 or 6 of his men to him, they put their bayonets to his breast and thus forced him to give it up, and demanded his money. The looting went on until dark, when most of the border ruffians, many drunk and reeling, finally stumbled from town. Part of their route home was lighted by flames from the home of Charles and Sarah Robinson, high atop Mount Oread. Only one person had been killed in the sack, and he a Southerner, struck dead by a stone falling from the hotel. End quote. One last little win for the Missourians was that Sheriff Jones finally succeeded in arresting Jacob Branson. As the sacking of Lawrence was progressing in Kansas, events on the national stage were also taking a violent turn. Just a couple of days before the sack, on May 19th, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts made a fiery speech on the Senate floor. He denounced the tactics of the pro-slavery faction in Kansas, calling Atchison's Missourians, quote, hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization in the form of men. End quote. Most provocatively, he said the following of pro-slavery Senator Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina. Quote, the senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry and believes himself a chivalrous knight, with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery. End quote. Now let Jay Monahan continue the account of what happened next. Quote, Senator Douglas replied to Sumner with equal vindictiveness. Such language as Sumner used, he said, might provoke some of us to kick him as we would a dog. Somebody was provoked to kick Sumner, truly enough. Representative Preston S. Brooks of South Carolina, a relative of Butler's, was known as an inoffensive man. He had spoken and voted for the Kansas-Nebraska bill and had contributed to Buford's immigrant aid plan, but he had sat aloof in the recent violent demonstrations in Congress. He had even introduced a resolution against carrying concealed weapons on the floor. Brooks was a large, handsome man, tall as Sumner, with black hair, bright eyes, and fashionably careless in dress. Rumbling with resentment, he skulked around the Capitol, waiting for a chance to horsewhip the Massachusetts senator. 2 days after Sumner's speech, but before full news of the sacking of Lawrence had come, Brooks entered the Senate chamber after adjournment and stepped to Sumner's desk, raised his gutta-percha cane, and flailed the senator's bowed head. Sumner tried to rise, found himself wedged under the desk, and soon fell bleeding and unconscious in the aisle. Another example of Southern lawlessness to shock the North. Brooks winced under the storm of protest, the comparison of his brutality with border ruffianism. He resigned his seat, but was immediately re-elected. Southerners sent him dozens of gold-headed canes, endorsing his viciousness and thus permitting the North to point with truth at the effect of slavery on Southern society. In a state of high excitement, the Democratic delegates left for Cincinnati to nominate a new president. As they took their seats, details came to them about the sacking of Lawrence. End quote. Now, I'll say again about the sacking of Lawrence. It wasn't a victory for the South, and neither was the caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks. And it's worth taking a second to think about this. What is a victory anyway? How is victory defined? Not in the sense of ultimate or final victory, but victory in a particular engagement. Well, to help define that, I think we can take a principle from a guy who is definitely in the conversation for the title of greatest soldier who ever lived, Napoleon Bonaparte. One of his maxims was that the ultimate objective of any war or campaign is really very simple: destroy the enemy's will or ability to continue the fight. To that end, Napoleon's strategy for every campaign he undertook always revolved around the destruction of the enemy's army in the field. That was in contrast to other generals of his time who would often be more focused on capturing key cities or valuable territory or something else they considered important. But Napoleon understood that to defeat an enemy, what you really need to do is break his will. And so with that principle, I think we could define victory as something that substantially contributes to the breaking of the enemy's will. And now you can see why I say that the sacking of Lawrence and the caning of Charles Sumner were not victories for the South. The two were very similar events in a certain sense, in that the only thing the Southerners involved really got out of them was a cathartic venting of rage upon their Northern opponents. But according to the Napoleonic definition of victory we just laid out, these events were the opposite of victories, because their effect was the opposite of breaking the enemy's will. With the help of reports from all the usual suspects in the abolitionist press, Northern will was galvanized by these events. And it was only a matter of time before the movers and shakers of the North would find a way to wrest control of Kansas territory from the slave power. But before that could happen, the Free State Party, already in the territory, would have to hold out a little longer. From Goodrich, quote, "While the Lawrence disaster did indeed arouse the North, and help was on its way, for the time being Kansans were on their own, and almost totally at the mercy of their Missouri masters. Of all the Free Staters in Kansas, however, there was one who refused to be cowed by recent events, nor was it in his nature to lie back and wait for others to act. And as for masters, he knew only the one. As a soldier of God, his duty was to wage war with evil wherever it was found, even if it meant fighting alone, even if it meant fighting unto death. While those about him were flying in fear and confusion or abandoning the cause in despair, he would stand his ground like a rock. Indeed, he would do more than that. He would not merely wait for the enemies of God to strike at him, but would instead strike at them. He would spread terror in the ranks of the foe. He was brave and bold, yet he was also as cruel and cold as a sword slash. Now his moment had arrived. Now he would act." End quote. By the time John Brown got word of the impending attack on Lawrence, it was too late for him to get there before the sack was all over. But of course, he didn't know that yet, and it wasn't going to stop him from trying. He likely received news of the threat on the evening of May 20th, the day before the sack, and immediately mustered his Potawatomi rifles, including his sons John Jr., Owen, Frederick, Salmon, and Oliver, and set out for Lawrence, marching through the night and most of the next day, May 21st. Toward the end of that day, or maybe the morning of the next day, they met with 2 riders from Lawrence in succession who reported that the town had already been taken and looted, but that federal troops were now on hand and had control of the situation. Brown was incensed to hear that there had been no resistance against the pro-slavery army, but he and his militia turned back for home. It was sometime during that march back home that Brown hatched the plan for what he was about to do. Why exactly he decided on the particular course of action he did is a little bit hazy to me, but there are a couple of theories. According to Goodrich, Brown's group got wind of the caning of Charles Sumner during that march, and that theory doesn't really hold water to me. It's true that Salmon Brown later reported that Old John went crazy when he heard about the Sumner incident, but like Horwitz says in his book, the timeline doesn't really check out for that. Brown and his men would have been marching back home on May 22nd to 23rd, and the caning incident happened in Washington, 1,500 miles away on May 22nd, in an era when fast long-distance communication didn't exist yet. News at this point traveled at the speed of a train or a horse, and there would have been no way for news of the caning to make it to Kansas territory at all, let alone to Brown's group out on the trail between settlements before the events we're about to talk about on the night of May 24th to 25th. Horwitz suggests that Salmon's memory was just hazy on this point, and I think he has to be right. The explanation Monahan gives makes a lot more sense to me. He has it as follows, quote, "On the morning of May 22nd, 1856, the riflemen had learned that they were too late. Lawrence had been sacked and the Free State Hotel burned. The men rested all day in the shade of their wagons discussing the raid. As they talked, H. Williams rode into camp reporting that pro-slavery men were evicting Free State settlers at Osawatomie or Dutch Henry's crossing of the Pottawatomie. Old John Brown, tall, spare, dressed in soiled clothes and a tattered straw hat, called his boys together and talked to them earnestly. He had wanted to fight the pro-slavery Missourians when they surrounded Lawrence last winter, but had been stopped. Now his people's homes on the Pottawatomie were threatened by the miscreants. Time had come for revenge." Brown's boys and a few others began sharpening their cutlasses on a grindstone. Early on the afternoon of May 23rd, Old Brown, 4 sons, a son-in-law, and 2 others started in a wagon for Dutch Henry's crossing, amid cheers from the 2 companies. Down the road they passed a traveler, James Blood, whom Brown had met in the Wakarusa War. The grim old man talked with him a few minutes and on leaving said, "We are on a secret mission. Don't speak of meeting us." End quote. John Jr. later wrote of the conversation among the Brown family before leaving their militia company. Quote, "It was now and here resolved that they, their aiders and abettors who sought to kill our suffering people, should themselves be killed, and in such a manner as should be likely to cause a restraining fear. Father proposed to return with several of my men. I assisted in the sharpening of his navy cutlasses. No man of our entire number could fail to understand that a retaliatory blow would fall." End quote. Despite that, John Jr. decided not to join his father's raiding party, thinking that dividing the company was a bad idea. He advised Old Brown to commit no rash act. The other 4 sons with the company did join their father, Owen, Frederick, Salmon, and Oliver, along with their brother-in-law, Henry Thompson. Horwitz says, quote, "Brown also recruited the 2 men he'd spoken to over breakfast. Theodore Wiener, a Polish Jew, ran a store near Dutch Henry's and had been harassed by its inhabitants. James Townsley, a painter, knew the pro-slavery settlement well and offered to carry Brown's band to the Pottawatomie in his 2-horse wagon." End quote. The 8 men led by Brown arrived at the Pottawatomie Creek sometime late in the day on May 23rd. They hid out in a deep ravine that night and all the next day. About 10 o'clock on the night of May 24th, they ventured out. James Doyle was a Tennessean and nominally a pro-slavery man, but in reality had little interest in politics. He was one of that large majority of Kansas settlers who had come to the territory to better their lot in life. He was a man who tried to keep his head down and hoped the escalating conflict over slavery wouldn't come near his home and family. It was at his cabin where Brown and crew first showed up on the night of May 24th. Doyle's wife, Mahala, later wrote, quote, "About 11 o'clock at night, after we had all retired, we heard some persons come into the yard and rap at the door and call for my husband. He got up and went to the door. Those outside inquired for Mr. Allen Wilkinson and where he lived. My husband told them that he would tell them. My husband opened the door and several came into the house and said they were from the army. They told my husband that he and the boys must surrender. They were their prisoners. They first took my husband out of the house. Then they took 2 of my sons, the 2 oldest ones, William and Drury, out, and then took them away. My son John was spared because I asked them in tears to spare him. I heard 2 reports of gunfire, after which I heard moaning as if a person was dying. Then I heard a wild whoop." End quote. James Townsley, one of Brown's party, reports what happened after Doyle and his 2 sons were taken from the cabin. Quote, "The old man Doyle and his 2 sons were marched some distance from the house, where a halt was made. Old John Brown drew his revolver and shot Doyle in the forehead, and Brown's 2 youngest sons immediately fell upon the younger Doyles with their swords. One of the young Doyles was stricken down in an instant, but the other attempted to escape and was pursued a short distance by his assailant and cut down." End quote. Doyle and his sons were not slave owners. They had nothing to do with the sacking of Lawrence. They had nothing to do with any harassment of Free State settlers in the area. But the Browns weren't done yet. After midnight, they moved on to their next target, the cabin of Allen Wilkinson, another Tennessean they had asked the Doyles about. Wilkinson was a member of the official pro-slave territorial legislature, but like Doyle, he was not a slave owner. Wilkinson's wife, Louisa, reported, quote, "We were disturbed by the barking of the dog. I was sick with the measles and woke up Mr. Wilkinson and asked if he heard the noise and what it meant. He said it was only someone passing about, and soon after was again asleep. It was not long before the dog raged and barked furiously, awakening me once more. Pretty soon I heard footsteps, as of men approaching. Saw one pass by the window, and someone knocked at the door. I asked, 'Who is that?' Someone replied, 'I want you to tell me the way to Dutch Henry's.' He commenced to tell them, and they said to him, 'Come out and show us.' He wanted to go, but I would not let him. He then told them it was difficult to find his clothes, and could tell them as well without going out of doors. The men out of doors after that stepped back, and I thought I could hear them whispering. But they immediately returned, and as they approached, one of them asked my husband, 'Are you opposed to the Northern or Free Soil Party?' When my husband said, 'I am,' one of them said, 'You are our prisoner. Do you surrender?' He said, 'Gentlemen, I do.' They said, 'Open the door.' Mr. Wilkinson told them to wait till he made a light, and they replied, 'If you don't open it, we will open it for you.' He opened the door against my wishes, and 4 men came in, and my husband was told to put on his clothes. I begged them to let Mr. Wilkinson stay with me, saying that I was sick and helpless and could not stay by myself. My husband also asked them to let him stay with me until he could get someone to wait on me. Told him that he would not run off, but would be there the next day, or whenever called for. The old man looked at me and then around at the children and replied, 'You have neighbors.' I said, 'So I have, but they are not here, and I cannot go for them.' The old man replied, 'It matters not,' and told him to get ready. My husband wanted to put on his boots and get ready, so as to be protected from the damp and night air, but they wouldn't let him. They then took my husband away. One of them came back and took 2 saddles. I asked him what they were going to do with him, and he said, 'Take him a prisoner to the camp.' After they were gone, I thought I heard my husband's voice. I went to the door, and all was still." End quote. And again, we get what happened next from Townsley. Quote, Wilkinson was taken and marched some distance south of his house. He was slain in the road with a sword by one of the younger Browns. After he was killed, his body was dragged out to one side and left. End quote. Wilkinson was not a slave owner. He had nothing to do with the sacking of Lawrence. And the Browns still weren't done with their murder spree. Dutch Henry himself turned out to be out of town that night, but his brother, William Sherman, was staying overnight at the cabin of James Harris. This account is from Harris. Quote, About 2 a.m., while my wife and child and myself were in bed, we were aroused by a company of men who said they belonged to the Northern Army. They came into the house and approached the bedside where we were lying and ordered us, together with 3 other men who were in the same house with me, to surrender, that it would be no use for us to resist. When they came up to the bed, some had drawn sabers in their hands, and some revolvers. They then took into their possession 2 rifles and a bowie knife, and afterwards ransacked the whole establishment in search of ammunition. They then took one of these 3 men, who were staying in my house, out. He came back. They then took me out, and asked me if there were any more men about the place. I told them there were not. They asked me if I had ever taken any hand in aiding pro-slavery men in coming to the territory of Kansas, or had ever taken any hand in the last troubles at Lawrence. They asked me whether I had ever done the Free State Party any harm, or ever intended to do the party any harm. They then said if I would answer no to all the questions which they had asked me, they would let me loose. End quote. Harris did answer no to all the questions and was spared. But William Sherman wasn't so fortunate. Again, Townsley gives us the account of what happened to him. Quote, We marched him down into the Pottawatomie Creek, where he was slain with swords by Brown's 2 youngest sons, and left lying in the creek. End quote. Sherman was not a slave owner, and he had nothing to do with the sacking of Lawrence. I'll read this account from Horwitz in Midnight Rising to finish this out, because it turns out the scene the next morning when the bodies were discovered was considerably more grisly than how Townsley described it. Quote, It was now Sunday morning, about 2 or 3 a.m. The terrified settlers along the Pottawatomie waited until dawn to venture outside. At the Doyles', the first house visited in the night, 16-year-old John found his father, James, and his oldest brother, 22-year-old William, lying dead in the road about 200 yards from their cabin. Both men had multiple wounds. William's head was cut open, and his jaw and side slashed. John found his other brother, 20-year-old Drury, lying dead nearby. His fingers were cut off, and his arms were cut off, John said in an affidavit. His head was cut open. There was a hole in his breast. Mahala Doyle, having glanced at the bodies of her husband and older son, could not look at Drury. I was so much overcome that I went to the house, she said. Down the creek, locals who went to the Wilkinsons' cabin to collect their mail found Louisa Jane Wilkinson in tears. She had heard about the Doyles and could not bring herself to go outside, for fear of what she might find. Neighbors discovered Alan Wilkinson lying dead in brush about 150 yards from the cabin, his head and side gashed, his throat cut. At Dutch Henry's Crossing, James Harris had also gone looking for his overnight guest, William Sherman. He found him lying in the creek. Sherman's skull was split open in 2 places and some of his brains was washed out by the water, Harris testified. A large hole was cut in his breast, and his left hand was cut off, except a little piece of skin on one side. End quote. John Brown is seen today as a controversial figure. He's seen as a guy who fought for a righteous cause, but might have just been a little too violent in doing so. The questions people will bring up and discuss around Brown are usually along the lines of when violence is or isn't justified in pursuit of a noble political goal. It's presented as the kind of issue that reasonable people can disagree on or have different opinions about. This is how it's taught in Kansas elementary schools, or at least it was 20 years ago when I was elementary school age. The thing is, discussions about that will almost always center not around the Potawatomi Massacre, but around Brown's actions from 3 years later in Virginia. We'll talk about Harper's Ferry in a future episode, but for now, I want to cover the account of a man who did not simply ignore or downplay the Potawatomi Massacre, unlike many of Brown's defenders would do later. James Redpath was an English journalist who came to America in the early 1850s and became an abolitionist. And he's one of the worst examples of a partisan hack I've ever seen. Shortly after Brown's death, he wrote a book called The Public Life of Captain John Brown. This book is not just a biography of Brown, it's a hagiography. And in case you think I'm exaggerating about that, I'll tell you that many times throughout the book, Redpath literally calls Brown a saint. To call the book flattering to Brown is a gross understatement. But Redpath doesn't simply ignore the Potawatomi Massacre. I'm going to read to you the chapter where he gives his account of that event, and I'm going to read it in full. It's not very long, it's just a few pages. I want to drive home for you how a villainous man like Brown is made into a saint by ideologues. This is The Public Life of Captain John Brown, Book 2, Chapter 5, called simply Potawatomi. Quote, I have spoken of the rumors of midnight murder in the Potawatomi region, and stated that Captain Brown was accused by the invaders of having done the deed. The charge is false. It was first made by his enemies, who feared him, and desired to drive him out of the district, and subsequently repeated by a recreant Free State journalist who sold himself to the federal administration for the paltry bribe of the public printing. The killing of the ruffians of Potawatomi was one of those stern acts of summary justice with which the history of the West and of every civil war abounds. Lynch law is one of the early necessities of far western communities, and the terrors of it form the only efficient guarantee of the peaceful citizen from the ruffianism which distinguishes and curses every new territory. The true story of Potawatomi is briefly told. In all that region, ever since the opening of the territory for settlement, the pro-slavery party had been brutally tyrannical. Free State men were daily robbed, beaten, and killed. Their property was stolen, openly, before their eyes, and yet they did not dare to resist the outrages. One or two families alone were occasionally exempted, by their character for desperate courage, from these daring and unwarrantable assaults. Among them were the sons and son-in-law of old John Brown, and even they had repeatedly suffered from the conduct of the ruffians, until the arrival of their father in the autumn, with arms. Then, until the months of April and May, a season of peace was allowed them. But when, in fulfillment of the plan of the Missouri secret lodges, the territory was to be conquered for slavery, it at once became a question of life, death, or immediate banishment to the settlers in southern Kansas, how they should act against the invading pro-slavery party and their allies among the squatters. Men who have passed their lives in the quiet of New England's valleys or in eastern cities can never know what it is to be in earnest on what is seemingly a mere question of political right or constitutional interpretation. Hence this chapter may shock them, but it is my duty nevertheless to write it. The pro-slavery party, in all the region around Potawatomi, renewed their system of aggressions on the Free State men. John Brown began to stir himself and prepare for the defense of his neighborhood. With 2 sons or friends, he went out into the prairies, where a number of invaders were encamped, and, pretending to survey the country, drove his imaginary lines through the middle of their camp. All the government officers in Kansas, from the governor down to the humblest workmen, were at this time and for long afterwards ultra pro-slavery men. Many of them professed secessionists who publicly cursed the Union as a burden to the South. John Brown frequently adopted this plan of entering the camp of the invading forces, and not only never was suspected, but was never asked what his political opinions were. Never doubting that he was a government surveyor, the Southrons never doubted his political orthodoxy. The men in this camp freely told him their plans. There was an old man of the name of Brown, they said, who had several sons here, whom it was necessary to get out of the way, as if they were driven out or killed, the other settlers would be afraid to offer any further resistance. They told him how Wilkinson, the Doyles, and a Dutchman named Sherman had recently been in Missouri and succeeded in securing forces to drive out the Browns, and that it was determined to kill them in the latter part of May. They mentioned several other prominent Free State men who were to share this fate. John Brown left their camp, and at once notified the settlers who had been marked out for destruction of the murderous designs of the Missourians. A meeting of the intended victims was held, and it was determined that on the first indication of the massacre, the Doyles, a father and 2 sons, Wilkinson and Sherman, should be seized, tried by lynch law, and summarily killed. On the 23rd day of May, John Brown left the camp of his son at Osawatomie with 7 or 8 men, and from that moment began his guerrilla warfare in southern Kansas. He ordered them to the vicinity of his home, to be ready for the Missourians when they came. He himself went in a different direction, for the purpose of obtaining further aid. On the night of the 25th of May, the Doyles, Wilkinson, and Sherman were seized, tried, and slain. This act was precipitated by a brutal assault committed during the forenoon on a Free State man at the store of Sherman, in which the Doyles were the principal and most ruffianly participators. These wretches, on the same day, called at the houses of the Browns, and, both in words and by acts, offered the grossest indignities to a daughter and daughter-in-law of the old man. As they went away, they said, "Tell your men that if they don't leave right off, we'll come back tomorrow and kill them." They added, in language too gross for publication, that the women would then suffer still worse indignities. What redress could the husbands of these women have received had they asked the protection of the law? They would have been obliged to seek it from Wilkinson, one of these ruffians, who was the magistrate of the Pottawatomie district. This instance had hundreds of parallels. I do not know whether New England people will be able to vindicate the summary punishment inflicted on these wretches, but I do know that nearly every Free State man then in Kansas, when he came to know the cause, privately endorsed it as a righteous act, although many of them, to save the party, publicly repudiated and condemned it. These facts I derived from 2 squatters who aided in the execution, and who were not ashamed of the part they took in it. Neither of them was a son of John Brown. They were settlers in the neighborhood. John Brown himself subsequently corroborated their statements, without knowing that they had made them, by his account of the affair and denial of any participation in it. "But remember," he added, "I do not say this to exculpate myself, for, although I took no hand in it, I would have advised it, had I known the circumstances, and I endorsed it as it was." "Time and the honest verdict of posterity," he said in his Virginia cell, "will approve of every act of mine." I think it will also endorse all the acts that he endorsed, and among them this righteous slaughter of the ruffians at Pottawatomie. John Brown did not know that these men were killed until the following day, for with one of his sons he was 25 miles distant at the time. He was at Middle Creek. This fact can be proved by living witnesses. It is false also that the ruffians were cruelly killed. They were tried, made confession, allowed time to pray, and then slain in a second. The effect of this act was highly beneficial to the security of the Free State men. It gave, indeed, to the preconcerted invasion an excuse for entering the territory, but by the terror which it inspired, by teaching the Missourians that the sword of civil war had a double edge, it saved the lives of hundreds who otherwise would have fallen the victims of Southern aggression. Everyone in Kansas at the time admitted that fact, although many of them deny it now. End quote. You might notice some discrepancies between that account and the one I gave before. I won't say definitively that Redpath just made a lot of that stuff up, but I will say there's no other evidence for a lot of the details outside Redpath's own account. For example, there's no evidence that the Browns had been threatened by anyone in the area. No evidence that the Doyles had ever assaulted anyone. No evidence that the Doyles or any of the other victims had ever even been to any of the Browns' houses, let alone harassed their daughters. Redpath says John Brown himself was 25 miles away when the killings happened, but we have eyewitness testimony from both Salmon Brown and James Townsley that the old man was there for the murders and shot James Doyle. Doyle was definitely found with a bullet in his forehead. Townsley claimed Brown shot and killed him. Salmon claimed that his father shot Doyle after he was already dead. I'm not sure which would be worse, but it's pretty certain that Brown was there for the murders and shot Doyle one way or the other. I don't know why Redpath said these things. It is known that he met John Brown personally about a month after the massacre. It's also true that Brown claimed not to have been present for the murders, but said that he approved of them. That's the story Brown's whole family would stick to until well after his death. It wasn't until later in his life that Salmon told the true story to a researcher and admitted that he'd lied before about his father not being there. So it's possible that Redpath just heard the accounts of Brown and his sons and took them at face value. Wouldn't be the first or the last time that a reporter just believed what was convenient for him and didn't do any more digging. And it's certain that Redpath had an interest in lionizing Brown. Of that first meeting with Brown, he wrote, quote, "I left this sacred spot with a far higher respect for the great struggle than ever I had felt before. I had seen the predestined leader of the second and holier American Revolution." End quote. Tony Horwitz's version is much more honest, as far as I can tell. I'll let him wrap up the account. Quote, "News of the murders along the Potawatomi spread quickly through the district. A day after the killings, when John Brown and his party rejoined the Free State force they'd left 3 days before, he was immediately confronted by his son Jason. A gentle man, known as the Tenderfoot of the Brown clan, Jason had stayed behind with his brother John Jr. while the others headed to Dutch Henry's. "Did you have anything to do with the killing of those men on the Potawatomi?" Jason demanded of his father. "I did not do it, but I approved of it," Brown answered. "I think it was an uncalled for, wicked act," Jason said. "God is my judge," his father replied. "We were justified under the circumstances." This was about as clear a statement as Brown would ever make about what became known as the Potawatomi Massacre. He spoke of it rarely, and then only in vague terms that suggested he was culpable without having personally shed any blood. His family hewed to this line. "Father never had anything to do with the killing, but he run the whole business," said Salmon, the most talkative of the 4 sons present. "The work was so hot and so absorbing that I did not at the time know where each actor was exactly, or exactly what each man was doing." The Browns and their allies cast the killings as an act of self-defense, a preemptive strike against pro-slavery zealots who had threatened their Free State neighbors and intended to harm them. The Browns' defenders also denied any intent on their part to mutilate the Kansans. Broadswords had been used to avoid making noise and raising an alarm. The gruesome wounds resulted from the victims' attempts to ward off sword blows. But this version of events didn't accord with evidence gathered after the killings. Mahala Doyle and James Harris both testified that they heard shots in the night, and Old Man Doyle was found with a bullet hole in his forehead, to go with a stab wound to his chest. Years later, the wagon driver in Brown's party, James Townsley, issued a confession in which he said John Brown had shot Old Man Doyle as the settlers' sons were being killed with swords. Salmon Brown, late in his life, admitted to a researcher that he lied in claiming that his father took no active part in the bloodshed. But he insisted that Brown shot Doyle late in the night, when the settler was already stone dead. "For what purpose I never knew," Salmon said, "but I always thought it was a signal for all the crowd to get together and go to our camp." This absolved his father of actual killing, and among Brown's defenders it became the accepted explanation of Doyle's bullet wound. But it made little sense. If a signal shot was all Brown intended, he could have fired in the air, instead of shooting a dead man in the face. Other statements in Brown's defense were likewise dubious. Broadswords, it was claimed, had been used for the sake of quiet, not with intent to mutilate. But if Brown wanted to avoid raising an alarm, why did witnesses report hearing gunshots, including the one that left a bullet in Doyle's forehead? The most plausible account of Brown's actions that night came from a family member who wasn't there, John Jr. Though initially opposed to his father's mission, he later wrote a lengthy defense of it. Until late May 1856, pro-slavery forces in Kansas had committed almost all the violence, killing 6 Free State men without reprisal. Lawrence's sacking was the last straw. As the Browns and their Free State allies stewed in camp, John Jr. said, they realized the enemy needed shock treatment, death for death. But the Potawatomi attack wasn't simply a matter of evening the score in Kansas. Those sentenced to die must be slain in such a manner as should be likely to cause a restraining fear, John Jr. wrote. In other words, the killing should so terrorize the pro-slavery camp as to deter future violence. End quote. Remember a while back when I said I don't think Brown was crazy, and that I don't think he ever committed any actions that could be described as erratic or irrational in the way King Saul's were? That absolutely holds true in this case. These murders were clearly premeditated. They were not committed in self-defense, or in some fit of rage, or even in direct retaliation for anything the victims had done. This was a cold, calculated act of political terrorism. The victims just happened to be at the wrong place, at the wrong time, on the wrong side of a political issue. And this act makes even more sense when viewed in light of Brown's vision of exactly how slavery was going to be abolished. See, Brown was a Calvinist, and often spoke of abolition in terms of atonement for the national sin of slavery, an atonement which would be made in the blood of Americans. Redpath mentions an 1857 letter Brown wrote to Hugh Forbes, who's a guy we'll mention in a future episode, in which he said, quote, "I expect no peace for this land until slavery is done for, and until it is washed away in blood." End quote. Also in 1857, Brown is reported to have met Henry David Thoreau. Yes, that Henry David Thoreau, and said to him, quote, "It will take a great deal of blood to wash away the sin of slavery, but we are ready." End quote. And the last quote I'll give you to hammer home this point, from Brown's statement to the court and the transcript of his Virginia trial in 1859. Quote, "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." End quote. John Brown was a true believer in his cause. He was religiously devoted to the abolition of slavery above all else, and he thought abolition could be brought about only by the sacrifice of American lives, possibly millions of them. Given those beliefs, it should come as a surprise to no one if he took actions calculated to bring about the massive bloodshed he thought was necessary. That's what the Potawatomi Massacre was. Beyond a simple spree of revenge killings, cold-blooded murders, or even an act of political terrorism, it was the first incision in the massive, crude 19th century surgery that Brown had prescribed for the nation. This man was made into a hero. Not just a hero, but a saint by the likes of James Redpath and his ilk. In fact, the final chapter of Redpath's book is titled "The Victory Over Death." In case you don't know, that's a direct parallel to Jesus Christ himself. And yeah, you could just say Redpath is a partisan hack, and you'd be right. But the thing is, he's far from the only one who ends up thinking this way about Brown. Not just in his own time, but right up to the current day. Man, I get worked up about this. In a just world that had its moral priorities in order, John Brown would be seen as more akin to a guy like Charles Manson than anyone else. And you know, that comparison occurred to me, and then the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I mean, there are some striking parallels between the two. The Potawatomi murders were not quite as sensational, but somewhat comparable in brutality to the Manson murders. Both involved home invasions. Both Manson and Brown were motivated by twisted ideologies. Yes, I say Brown's ideology was twisted. It's not the anti-slavery view itself that's twisted, it's the way he thought it needed to be ended through what functionally amounted to human sacrifice. Both Manson and Brown imagined apocalyptic violence that would ultimately bring about their envisioned future, and the violence they actually committed was designed to help bring that about. Both had cult-like followers that committed most or all of the actual killing on their behalf. I'll grant that Brown's followers seem less cult-like than Manson's, but they certainly followed him, were devoted to him, and did the things they did on his orders, or at least with his approval, if you want to be as charitable as possible about it. That's how Brown would be seen in a just world. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world where the Puritans won, and their stories are the ones that have dominated the American mythos ever since. It's their story that made Brown into a mythic hero that the North could rally around during the war. And later, as more research was done and Brown's character as a whole became less and less defensible, the picture of him was walked back from saintly, virtuous freedom fighter and Christ-like sacrifice on the altar of freedom to somewhat ambiguous character who fought for a righteous cause but might have gone too far at times. And we can use him as a jumping-off point to ask interesting philosophical questions like, when is violence justifiable in support of a cause? Until more recently, you get a guy like Tony Horowitz who published Midnight Rising in 2011 and presents a much more balanced picture of Brown. But I'm not interested in balance. I'm interested in what's true. And what's true about Brown is that he was a true believer in some really messed up theology. And his beliefs led him to commit evil acts in the name of what he thought was righteousness. Josiah Royce said of Charles Robinson in California that he was, quote, in the devil's service, but served the devil honestly, thoughtfully, and, so far as he could, dutifully, believing him to be an angel of light, end quote. I think that statement applies perfectly to John Brown as well. As we wrap this episode up, I'll give you my real deep cut about John Brown. I'll bring it up again, and I want you to keep it in mind as we talk about Brown's actions later in this series. Going back to that point about motives from part 1. Even though I despise Brown personally, I've been giving him one benefit of the doubt thus far, and that is to grant that he was seriously dedicated to ending slavery. I think his methods for doing it were appalling and evil, but at least you can say the motive was noble. And that's what the debate about him has hinged on ever since. Now I want to even call that into question. I'm actually not completely sure what I think about this ultimately, but the question I want to leave you with is this. If a person believes that their goal requires catastrophic violence and destruction to be accomplished, is it fair to suggest that their real goal is the violence itself? If that were the case, it would make the stated goal little more than an excuse. On this hypothesis, Brown's abolitionism would be just the story he told himself to legitimize what he was doing. Maybe if this is the case, he even deeply believed that story. Like I said, I'm not even sure what my own answer to that question is. What I am sure of is that John Brown was willing to see millions die if necessary to accomplish his goals. The war he helped precipitate would get pretty damn close to those numbers. You might say it didn't get all the way there, at least in part just due to the limitations of military technology of the time compared to what it would be in the 20th century, and thank God for that. The other thing I'm sure of is that Brown had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The reality of the Potawatomi murders was as bad as the most salacious and exaggerated headlines from Southern propaganda newspapers. Whatever hope was left of calming the situation in Kansas without massive further bloodshed was fading fast with every new copy that rolled off the printing presses. And for John Brown, the central, giant, prophetic, messianic figure from John Stewart Curry's tragic prelude, that was exactly how he wanted it.
Bury me not on the lone prairie. These words came low and mournfully from the pallid lips of a youth who lay on his dying bed at the close of day. Bury me not on the lone prairie, where the wild coyote will howl o'er me, where the buffalo roams on the prairie sea. Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie. It makes no difference, so I've been told, where the body lies when life grows cold. But grant, I pray, one wish to me. Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie. I've often wished to be laid when I died by the little church on the green hillside, by my father's grave, there let mine be. Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie. The cowboys gathered all around the bed to hear the last words that their comrade said. Oh, partners all, take a warning from me. Never leave your homes for the lone prairie. Don't listen to the enticing words of the men who own large droves and herds. For if you do, you'll rue the day that you left your homes for the lone prairie. Oh, bury me not, but his voice failed there. But we paid no heed to his dying prayer. In a narrow grave, just 6 by 3, we buried him there on the lone prairie. We buried him there on the lone prairie, where the buzzards fly and the wind blows free, where the rattlesnakes rattle and the tumbleweeds blow across his grave on the lone prairie. And the cowboys now, as they cross the plains, have marked the spot where his bones are lain. Fling a handful of roses o'er grave and pray to the Lord that his soul be saved. In a narrow grave, just 6 by 3, we buried him there on the lone prairie.
On the next episode of American Guerrillas, the backlash from the Potawatomi Massacre hits Kansas territory. Jim Lane returns to liberate the territory from the iron fist of the Missourians. While caught in the middle, settlers with sympathies to both sides, or neither, try to get on with their already tough lives under constant threat of burning, pillaging, and cold-blooded murder. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to support me, I would greatly appreciate it. You can do that on a recurring basis for $5 a month or $50 a year on Substack, and that also comes with access to paid-only articles there. For now, those are reviews of the books I'm reading for research on this series. There are 2 of those up already, maybe 3 by the time this episode goes out, and there will continue to be more as I write them up. You can find that at the Unsung Substack on substack.com, and I'll also put a link in the show notes. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can do that too, through PayPal or Venmo. Those links are also in the show notes. Donations are never expected, but always appreciated. Like I said in the intro, episode 3 is almost done already, and this time it's not just most of the research that's already done, but most of the writing and recording too. I'm out of town on a trip next week with no internet access, so expect episode 3 in the last couple weeks of October if you're listening to this near upload time. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for the next one, that the deeds of men shall not go unsung.